Oh, okay. I was like, what? I'm missing it. Okay. Terry.
Yes.
Adam, are you married?
Yep.
Sure, yes, it will be.
Oh.
Your vacation is our vacation.
All right. The mics are hot, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to the second meeting of the Lincoln City Council for 2019. I'm going to ask you all to join me as we stand and do a pledge of allegiance to the flag, and we'll follow that with a moment of silent meditation before you sit down. Ready? Here we go. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Again, thank you all for joining us. I have a little bit of paperwork I need to do before we start. In accordance with LB 898, the copy of the Open Meetings Act is posted to the back of the chamber. The order of the business before the City Council is as follows. The City Clerk will read items listed on the agenda under public hearing. Anyone wishing to speak on an agenda item should come forward after the clerk reads that item. The applicant and those in favor should read first, then those in opposition. The applicant may make a short rebuttal statement after that. Each speaker should begin by stating their name, address, and whether you're speaking in favor of or opposition to an item. Testimony is limited to 5 minutes per speaker. After all public hearings, the City Council will vote on resolutions and items listed under third reading, and on the second and last meeting of the month immediately prior to adjournment, anyone may speak on any item not listed on the current agenda for that date, nor planned for a future agenda. And we have today, before we start our regular agenda items, the mayor is with us today to talk about his award for excellence. I always get that wrong. Mayor's award. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
I hope it's the case that no opposition is allowed to the Mayor's Award of Excellence. I wanted to reassure Adam a little bit here. But we're presenting the Award of Excellence this time around. It's for the month of December, and it's being presented to arborist Adam Klingberg. He is with the forestry section of Parks and Recreation, and Adam has worked for the city since 2005. Janet Ball of the forestry section nominated Adam in the category of customer relations for his work responding to the damage in the latest snowstorm. That is the snowstorm of October 14th. The nomination was prompted by a letter from Senior Public Safety 911 dispatcher Lucinda Davis. She wrote, "I just wanted to let somebody know how great your staff was over the weekend with the snow. I had my first request for downed trees around noon on Sunday, and it snowballed from there. Adam was the first person on my list. He answered the phone quickly and jumped right in." And he was probably hoping that most of those were ash trees, Mr. Chairman. Lucinda said Adam arranged for more crews to respond to the large number of requests and had her email complaint updates sent directly to Adam, which made my job, she said, so much easier. He even checked back with me before he went home. Lucinda added, "I'd been here long enough to remember when contacting somebody after hours was not so easy. Thank your entire staff for me. They were great to work with." Janet said that in her 20 years with the forestry section, she cannot recall a crew receiving a compliment like the one from Lucinda. So it's my pleasure to present Adam with the Mayor's Award of Excellence for December. Please join me in congratulating Adam for his hard work and for his commitment to our city of Lincoln. Adam, come on up.
Speech.
Hang out up here with me just for a minute. A couple of people want to say a couple of kind words about you, starting with Chris Myers, Parks Operations Coordinator.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for this opportunity. I had the opportunity to hire Adam in 2005 in the Northeast District Parks, and it's been a pleasure working with him since then. He left the Parks section in about 2011 and moved over to work with the Forestry section, and he's done an excellent job there. His crew is continuously getting accolades from the public on trees that they've worked on in their communities and in their property right-of-ways. And also Adam's name is first on the list, but he actually asked to be put first on the list about March of last year, so he'd be the first one called out. So that kind of illustrates the character that Adam has and the desire to make sure that we have good public service to all of our citizenry. So Adam, congratulations. You're well deserving. Thank you very much.
And I'll add a very brief note. If you've worked with Adam, you know that he has great good humor. He just approaches his work with such a positive attitude. That smile that you see on his face is there every day, which is incredible. And Adam also has a significant customer service attitude that he brings to his work as well. Adam, we appreciate everything that you do every day.
Thanks. I really appreciate the award. Thanks a lot. That means a lot. My wife and kids are here to witness it, so thanks again. It means a lot. I appreciate it.
Where Adam. Councilman Esker, would you like to ask the question?
So those aren't your wife and kids. Where are your wife and kids?
Yeah, which ones are the wife?
My wife's over there with the camera. That's Christy.
Okay, all right.
And then my boys are in the back, hiding out.
All right, good.
They're actually quiet, so it's good.
Congratulations.
Home, it's all family.
Yeah.
Thanks again,
Congratulations.
guys.
Thank you very much for your service to the city. We'll take a moment, let the award-winning party move outside, and then we'll go back to our regular agenda, Teresa, at your convenience.
Okay. All right, ready?
Ready, okay.
All right. Our first item, just a reminder to the public, due to the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, the City Council will not meet on Monday, January 21st. We ask those of the general public coming forward to testify to please clearly state your name, spell your name, give your address, and sign in on the sign-in sheet laying on the podium. Testifiers may use either microphone, and there is a sign-in sheet by each microphone. We ask city staff who are testifying to please state your name, title, and the department you work for. Our first item of business is our public hearing consent agenda, items 1 through 3. Is Roger Massey here? Would you please come forward?
Roger Massey, M-A-S-S-E-Y, 4130 Taliesin Drive, Lincoln.
Good afternoon, Mr. Massey.
Here I am.
Thank you for coming forward. Looks like you're accepting an appointment to the Lincoln Housing Authority.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Could you tell us a little bit about your interest in the organization?
Well, my life career has all been in housing policy, economic development, and city planning. I've served on the Planning Commission. I've served on the Housing Authority, filling a vacancy when Judge Blue retired. So I'm coming out of retirement and going to contribute as much as I can to get affordable housing going.
Thank you very much. That sounds, Councilwoman Lamb.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Mr. Massey. I saw how qualified you are for this position, and we're pulling you out of retirement, as you said. You know, I just want to make sure you know it's not a high-paying position, right?
Well, you should do something about that.
Thank you very much for your willingness to serve.
Other comments from the council? Thank you very much, Mr. Massey. Teresa, we have a lot of reappointments on here. Is there anything else that, one reappointments?
No, Mr. Massey is our only appointment, so we
Excellent.
can vote on these items. Items 1A through D were introduced by Raybold.
So moved.
Second?
Have a motion by Councilwoman Raybold, a second by Councilman Eskridge. Discussion of the motion? Would you call the roll, please?
Camp,
Yes.
Christensen,
Yes.
Eskridge.
Yes.
Gaylor Baird,
Yes.
Lamb,
Yes.
Raybold,
Yes.
Schob.
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0. Then item 2A was introduced by Camp.
So moved.
Second?
Have a motion by Councilman Camp, second by Councilman Eskridge. Discussion? Teresa, please call the roll.
Camp,
Yes.
Christensen,
Yes.
Eskridge.
Yes.
Gaylor Baird,
Yes.
Lamb,
Yes.
Raybold,
Yes.
Schob.
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0. Next are our public hearing liquor resolutions. Those giving testimony are asked to come forward, raise their right hand for the clerk to administer the oath. After the oath, witnesses shall state their names and addresses. Item 4A is the manager application of Wayne Hamill for Famous Dave's at 2750 Pine Lake Road. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth as you verily believe it to be?
I do.
Thank you. Just state your name and address.
Wayne Hamill, and you want the restaurant's address or mine?
Restaurant's fine.
2750 Pine Lake Road.
Mr. Hamill, thank you for coming forward today. Could you tell us a little bit about why you're here and your application?
I'm the operating partner of this location and on site.
Okay. Questions for this applicant? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to testify on this item?
Thank you, Teresa. I fell asleep there. Does anyone else in the audience like to testify on this agenda item? Seeing no one coming forward, may we move to our next agenda item?
Yes, item 4B is the manager application of Lori Crocker for Lincoln Stars Hockey at 1880 Transformation Drive. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth as you verily believe it to be?
I do.
Thank you. Just state your name and address.
Lori Crocker, 1880 Transformation Drive.
Good afternoon, Ms. Crocker. Tell us a little bit about your application. What brings you here today?
I'm the new Director of Business Operations for the Lincoln Star, so we're just updating our manager application.
Thank you. Are there questions from the council? Ms. Crocker, thank you very much. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to testify on this agenda item? Thank you very much.
All right, next I'll call items 4C and D. They're the application of T180 Development LLC, doing business as Tavern 180, for a Class I liquor license at 8600 South 30th Street, Suite 106, and the related manager application of Brett Clearer. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth as you verily believe it to be?
I do.
Thank you. Just state your name and address.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name's Sean Kelly at 2804 South 87th Avenue, Omaha, Nebraska. Appearing this afternoon on behalf of the applicant. This is a new application, new location, 8600 South 30th Street. The applicants are very experienced in the hospitality industry and look forward to bringing this concept to Lincoln. Happy to answer any questions.
Are there questions from the council? Councilman Eskridge.
Yes, tell us about the concept.
Yeah, so this is a high-end steakhouse. The name can be a little misleading, but it's a little higher end, a little under 3,000 square feet. So it's a relatively small area, but definitely some fine food on the higher end.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Gaylor Baird.
Thanks for being here today.
Yeah.
I just had a question. You know, as we evaluate these, we don't have the final say.
Sure.
We're just meant to screen through. And one of the red flags we're told to look for is past convictions for DUIs. And the ones in question for the manager and the business partner are not particularly recent, so that's helpful.
Sure.
But I was hoping that there could be some testimony about how those experiences will shape their approach to liquor management, because obviously we want to have responsible liquor management.
Sure, of course. Thank you for that opportunity. As I mentioned in the intro, this applicant, same with that history you mentioned, has been in the business for over 10 years in the state of Nebraska. Really a good, responsible applicant and operator. We've addressed those issues in prior applications. In fact, this council did forward that concern to the Liquor Control Commission for a Tanner's location here in Lincoln. There's been no liquor violations at that location. They do regular training and provide a good atmosphere and a safe atmosphere for citizens of both Omaha and Lincoln where they're at in Nebraska.
Thank you.
Other questions from the council? Mr. Kelly, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone in the chamber that would like to testify on this agenda item?
Mr. Chair, seeing none, I would move approval of items 4A through 4D.
Second.
You have a motion by Councilman Camp and a second by Councilman Eskridge for approval of items 4A through D. Any additional discussion of the motion? Teresa, would you call the roll for us, please?
Camp?
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb?
Yes.
Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried, 7-0. Next then are our public hearing resolutions. Item 5A is declaring the official intent of the city to reimburse certain expenses in connection with acquiring, constructing, equipping, and furnishing wastewater improvements of the city from the proceeds of bonds issued by the city.
Afternoon, Brandon Kaufman, Finance Director for the city. So this is kind of a similar item that you saw back in October. It's something that the city typically does on a normal basis when we're getting ready to issue bonds due to Treasury IRS requirements. We have to pass an official resolution of intent saying that we are going to reimburse the city with proceeds. So currently, wastewater has some projects going on that we intend to reimburse ourselves for the funds that are currently being spent. We also have Donna Garden available if you have any questions about specific types of projects. So this is not an approval of the issuance of bonds currently. This is actually just saying that we intend to reimburse ourselves for the money that we're currently spending on wastewater projects. These bonds are solely backed by revenue generated by the utility as well and not affiliated with any type of property tax.
I think Councilwoman Lamb has some questions, and Councilman Camp.
Thank you. So we're going to reimburse from the bonds, but these are bonds that haven't yet been issued, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, and so what happens? So this would be a bond that'll be in front of the people for a vote?
This is a bond that's backed by the revenue generated by the wastewater utility. So this is a revenue bond that has no correlation or doesn't have any type of property tax backing. So there is no public vote that's required for revenue bonds.
I see, so it'll be passed by the council and signed by the mayor. And what if something happened and the bond wasn't issued?
If the bond wasn't issued, then I think nothing happens. I might ask bond counsel, there is some limitation, I think, on how long this might go out, but he would be able to answer for sure.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike Rogers with Gilmore and Bell Bond Counsel to the city.
Mr. Rogers?
This does not obligate the city to issue bonds. And if the bonds are not ultimately issued, then there would be no consequence to passing this resolution. This is simply a resolution stating that the city's intent is to reimburse itself from bond proceeds if bonds are issued down the road.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question? Okay, great.
Councilman Camp.
Well, Mr. Rogers, yes, that you can probably help me here too. Two questions. The very first, section 1A says the city has begun acquiring, constructing equipment, and furnishing certain improvements. So it sounds like the trigger has been released.
My understanding is that some of the projects intended to be financed with the bonds have begun. This resolution, under the IRS regulations, the city can take reimbursement for those construction expenditures up to 60 days prior to today's date if this resolution were adopted. So going back to mid-November, any construction expenditures that had been made out of other funds of the city could be reimbursed or replenished from bond proceeds, as well as engineering expenditures or other preliminary expenditures for further back than the 60 days.
Do we have an idea how much the $28 million has been expended?
I don't personally. I think
I don't know if
Donna
Ms. Garden does.
Councilwoman
I
Taylor?
mean, part of it is that one of the biggest projects to be funded by this is Stevens Creek, so that's already underway. So I'm.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Donna Garden. I'm the Assistant Director of Lincoln Transportation Utilities.
Could you shed some light on this for us, please?
I'm sorry?
Could you shed some light on this for us?
I can. Actually, what this does is we have a number of projects that are coming up. We're planning on bond dollars for our new growth projects. We have a total of in this biennium that's been passed, of $27.8 million in new growth projects. That includes an $11 million expenditure for Stevens Creek. So that's the biggest one that we have. It is underway. It's under construction. It's been under construction since about September of last year. This would reimburse some of those dollars that we've already spent for construction. If the bond didn't go through, we wouldn't be doing the future new growth projects. That would be it. Those are strictly the dollars we're going to be using for those CIP projects that were already approved.
So can you tell us how much has been expended in the last 60 days that Mr. Rogers said would be reimbursable?
I don't think I have a total for you on that. The total construction of that project is, I think, that including design, was $15.4 million. But it is about 2/3 of the way completed in construction right now and expected to be completed in June.
So you're saying 2/3 of the 11 or the 15 million, 10 million has been expended?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. I don't have an exact dollar figure there.
I mean, that's a substantial amount.
It is, correct.
And from what Mr. Rogers said, anything before 60 days ago would not be reimbursable.
We understand that.
So I guess just kind of trying to understand where the cash flowed, and so I assume some of that.
We would like to use some of these bond dollars to reimburse ourselves, but we have a total of almost $30 million in new growth projects in this biennium that was just approved for the budget. So that's what this bond dollars are covering. We would like to use it for the Stevens Creek project. Accounting is easier for one large project versus multiple small ones. It's just a matter of convenience which dollars go where. So we have enough rates to cover both the revenue bond, including cash on hand and our debt coverage going forward. So we're planning on maximizing our ability to bond.
So if you've got enough cash on hand and say there was this $28 million revenue bond, what happens to all that money from the bond? I mean, if you're going to reimburse yourself, then you freed up substantial millions of dollars.
No, we have enough new growth projects to consume those dollars. If we don't get the bond passed, then those projects would not be able to be done. And that doesn't include the amount that we've expended on Stevens Creek. We could cover that, but we have going forward in time, we've got a number of new growth projects that we have to do in order to handle the growth that we're seeing in the city right now. And that was in the CIP during our budget discussions.
Is there a reason why this resolution couldn't have come to us many months ago before all this work was started for this $10 million or what have you?
We really don't like to bond, obviously, before we need the dollars. And I don't know if there's any distance in time between when we issue and this particular reimbursement resolution. But we have planned this so that we can issue the bond at the moment in time when we actually need the dollars. We certainly don't want to pay interest on something that we don't need the dollars for.
I guess I'm just concerned by that language in paragraph 1A that says you've begun acquiring and so forth. It just seems like even that this resolution could have come before us many months ago, as it didn't dictate the actual bonding, but at least then the public's aware and we're aware that you're looking ahead at a $28 million revenue bond.
We thought this was the appropriate time to do it, so it handles our design costs for Stevens Creek and the vast majority of the expenditures that we've had for construction.
It just puts us in a difficult position not to go ahead with it, and I think that even if you not do the other growth expenditures, it just seems like it'd be more wise to come ahead of it. So I'd encourage you in the future to do that so that there's a proper sequence of things. The other question I had was on this $28 million, and this might be for you, Ms. Garden. How does this relate to past revenue bonds that we've done in wastewater management?
It is larger than our previous ones that we've had before, but we've not seen projects of this magnitude. And when we discussed the budget this last biennium, we talked a lot about the expenditures we were going to have to make in wastewater. We knew there was going to be a large bond, require a large bond issuance to cover all of that new growth work. And that doesn't include just the collection system, it includes the treatment plants as well. They will require growth in order to expand and meet the needs of the community. So there's no new projects associated with these bond dollars. They were all in the approved CIP. And it is larger, and we recognize that.
Could you give us a comparison of how much past bonds have been?
I think past bonds have ranged anywhere, and maybe Bond Council has some more information on that, but
Not offhand, I'm not sure, but
I'm not sure what they ranged from. Maybe Brandon, do you?
I was just looking. I can't tell you the exact range as of right now. At the end of 18-19, without this current issue, just with what's outstanding, there's about $63 million that are still outstanding.
And those have a life expectancy of how long?
The final payments on those will go out till 31, 32.
So if you've got 63 million outstanding, does that reflect that, as Ms. Garden was saying, the previous ones have been much smaller? So what are we looking at? 28 million versus 5 million?
And I can't tell you per issue, I guess, right now, how much, what the sizing of those were at the time of issuance. I'd have to go back and do some research on that.
And these have a term of how many years typically?
Typically 20 years.
So you've got some, if you go to 30-33, that have another 14 years, so maybe halfway through. Okay. Again, just from, I guess, understanding and so forth, it would be helpful to, I know we have the budget session too, in season, but to get it out on the table.
Thank you, Councilman. Thank you, Councilman. Other questions from the council?
Well, just to clarify, because I appreciate the concern about being cautious, but we had a bunch of pre-budget meetings, and then during the budget session and the public hearings, this was discussed as the basis for the wastewater utility rates and some of the increases, and we talked about the Stevens Creek trunk sewer fostering, the development east of Lincoln at length. Can you talk about the other projects that are included in this revenue bond, just to refresh our memory? Since
I can. We've got a number of them. We have a lot of improvements at the wastewater treatment plants themselves. Stevens Creek now will be receiving a lot more flow from that Stevens Creek trunk line. So we also have to handle the solids that comes from that treatment plant. So there's a large upgrade at Northeast. We have a number of different treatment that we have to apply at Teresa Street, both to meet limits and also just because of the additional growth that we've seen there as well. We have the Southwest trunk line that's going in. That will go to Southwest Village in the southwest portion of the city. We have Beal Slough will be paid for from this also, which is an additional line that runs through Beal Slough to handle the growth from the south part of the city. So we have a number of other projects that are underway. I've got probably about 15 of them. And again, the total in the 2 fiscal years that have been approved is about $27.8 million.
Thank you. Other questions? Ms. Garden, thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have anything else to add, Mr. Kaufman? No. We are in a public hearing. Is there anyone else that would like to testify on this agenda item? Seeing no one coming forward, Teresa, may we move to our next item?
Next would be item 5B, accepting a report of new and pending claims against the city for December 1st through the 31st, 2018.
And if you're not together, there are 2 microphones. If you'd like to come in, go ahead and sign in and kind of form a small line there. Good afternoon, welcome.
Thank you. My name is Johnette Klein. I live at 1992 Park Avenue. And on November 19th, 2018, I filed a claim against the City of Lincoln for damage to my property at 1992 Park Avenue. And the damage occurred on 9/1/18 in the evening. a city tree planted in the easement between the sidewalk and the street at 1980 Park Avenue, which is directly west of me, fell and damaged my roof, gutters, downspouts, fencing, plantings, to the amount of $3,716.33. I based my claim on a conversation I had with a Parks and Rec arborist on the morning of 9/2/2018 when the Parks and Recs came out to clean up the mess. And at that time, she told me that the tree was hollow and the city knew it needed to be removed. She further stated that this was not an act of God, but of negligence on the part of the city. In December, I received a letter from the city attorney's office saying they were denying my claim. And I have additional pictures that I just received yesterday from from another neighbor that has no stake in this claim at all. That shows that the tree was hollow, and I'm just requesting that the city council reconsider the city attorney's decision. And I do have pictures. Face up?
Yeah, face up.
Yeah, it'll come on in just a second. There we go.
There you go.
This is not my property. This is the 1980 the house at 1980 Park Avenue. But it's really of the tree that fell. It was a huge old tree. And this might be a better picture of the tree and how it was damaged and kind of hollow in that area. This is my home at 1992 Park Avenue. You can see that the branches of the tree landed on my roof. This is one of the crew members, and you can see that the tree is hollow. And then this is just another picture, a little more up close of that tree trunk. And I believe the man that was here, Adam, that received that reward, it was he and his crew that were at my house on that, or at that
Did the cleanup.
He did, and they did a great job, and they were absolutely right. They were so good to the people that were around there, and that I had questions, and they were answering questions. They were very polite. They didn't tell me just to get the hell out of the way. They were just very, very nice. And this is my last picture. So I'm just asking that you reconsider the county attorney's decision.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions from the council?
We have the city attorney.
Councilwoman Raybold, was that?
Ms. Klein, were you aware, did your neighbor report any problems with that tree before I guess, September 1, the day that it fell?
No, I don't know that he did. That was the night of the storm where they canceled the football game, if that helps you. It was a great storm. And the crew had come by that night to see what the damage was, but they couldn't do anything because of the lightning and the storms, but they were there bright and early the next day and did a great job at cleanup.
Councilman Camp, did you want to speak with someone from staff?
Well, I think both, I guess, Parks and Rec and our city attorney.
And for the next people up testifying, I'm sorry, I probably encouraged you a little too soon. If you'd like to sit in the front row for a second, it'll only be a couple seconds while we hear from our staff. I didn't want you to get tired from standing there.
Chris Connolly, Acting City Attorney.
Could you enlighten us a little bit more?
Yes. As the council is aware, we really have to have knowledge that a tree is bad before any damage should be paid by the city. And in this case, we have no knowledge, no records indicating that there was a problem with this tree prior to this incident. And it was the September 1 storm, as Ms. Klein indicated, and that was a bad storm, did have strong winds. Now, Ms. Gruber, who did go out and look at this, did note some decay at the bottom, but what she reports to us is that she believes it was the weather that most likely caused this damage here and caused the tree to topple. It really kind of broke off at the bottom, towards the bottom of the tree. And so that was not something that was known to the city prior to that day, and that's really the test for when the city is going to be liable. Now, we have, to my knowledge, we have not received a claim with regard to the property at 1980 Park Avenue, where you see that damage there. What happened was it hit this house that you see here, and then rolled over and hit Ms. Klein's house, apparently.
Questions for this testifier from the council?
I guess if you could remain, but Mr. Johnson, could you address this? And then Ms. Klein was also talking about the people that came out and said the city was negligent, or help us out on that statement.
It is a good, yeah, thank you very much. Lynn Johnson with Lincoln Parks and Recreation. We've gone back and we've looked at the tree history on this block. From about the early 2000s, there was work done at 13 different properties. Here, there were 6 trees removed on this block between the period of about 2000 and 2014. This tree we have no tree history for, so we don't have any indication that there were requests or calls for service on this tree. It was a big pin oak. I think this image may help a little bit. This is the base of that large pin oak, and you can see that it has some base rot up against the curb. We were not aware that condition existed, and I'm not sure what caused that. Obviously, the curb is being heaved there, and so this is a pretty narrow space for a big pin oak to be trying to grow. But I think the significance here is that we don't have any record of any request for service on this tree.
Other questions from these two testifiers from the council? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Ms. Klein, just for your information, the way this works, we'll go through any other testimony, then we'll move through our agenda, and we'll come back and vote at the end of all our resolutions. So we've gotten your testimony and the testimony from staff.
She does have the opportunity for rebuttal, if she would like.
Would you like to add anything else?
I can only tell you that Lori Gruber did tell me that morning. She was on my property in my front yard and told me that that tree was hollow and that the city knew it was hollow and needed to be removed. I have gone and talked to her after I got my letter of denial, and then and her response was, "I don't believe I would have said that." So it's what I heard, it's what she said to me, and that's all I can say. But thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Klein, did you have insurance? Did it help cover for any of the damage, the cost of any damage?
I have insurance, but it's a $1,500 deductible. Plus, if I file a claim, my insurance will go up. And
So you didn't file a claim?
I have not yet filed a claim. I felt that since Lori had told me that the city would take care of it. So I have not filed a claim with my insurance company.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Thank you, Ms. Klein. Sorry about the delay.
That's okay. Kathy and Kyle Wobig, 6327 Cornflower Drive. We too filed a claim with the city on October 25th regarding damages to our plumbing. We are bringing this claim to you in hopes that you will reconsider, and we are seeking reimbursement for those damages. I have a quick timeline of events. This started at on June 27th when there was a water main break. I wanted to make sure phone numbers weren't on there. On Fletcher near our neighborhood. The next morning the water was turned back on, and when the water was turned back on to the neighborhood, the force was so great it blew our sprinkler system out of the ground and completely blew it apart. We had Judson Irrigation come out, as well as somebody from the city, and it was repaired. Shortly after that, our water heater stopped working. we hired Mark's Plumbing to come out and take a look at that. He discovered our plumbing lines were filled with rocks. At that time, we had Dave Calkins came out. He took a look at the water screen, the water meter screen. After he investigated that, he shared with me that there was a small hole in the screen. I said, could the rocks that have filled our plumbing lines come in through that screen? He told me he didn't know. I said, well, if they didn't come in through there, where did they come in from? How would rocks get into our plumbing line? He didn't know. We ended up having damage done to our hot water heater, our water softener, our washing machine, our jacuzzi tub, 2 bathtubs, all 4 toilets, 3 showers, and 6 sinks. All of those had to be flushed out by Mark's Plumbing, and Mark is with us here today as well. I have pictures that show the rocks that were flushed out. I also sent in a sample of the rocks when we had our claim, so I don't know if that sample made it to you or not. Here's some more in the bath. And about a month after that, our washing machine stopped working, and we had that replaced. When they were hauling it out, they found more rocks filled in the line. So there's been quite a few rocks that filled in our plumbing. The total amount for just the flushing of the rocks and the water softener was completely damaged beyond repair comes to $2,888.22. We are not seeking reimbursement for the hot water heater because that was older, and it was in replacing that we discovered everything was filled with the rocks and the pebbles. We are also not asking for reimbursement from the time we had to spend away from our home when we had no plumbing. I guess questions, and like I said, we have Mark with us too.
Questions from the council? Councilman Camp and then
I was
Councilman
writing
Raybold.
down here. What are you claiming for? You know, you heard the flushing of the
The
system?
flushing of the plumbing and the replacement of the water softener system.
Softener. Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Raybold?
And then, were you able to file a claim with your insurance company for some of?
We did contact our insurance company right away, and they said, let's first file with the city, see what happens, and we'll go from there. So we have already filed with the city. That was denied. The city then sent us the letter saying to bring our claim to you, and that's why we're here today.
Other questions from the council? You said your plumber was here?
Yes.
My name is Mark Catula for Mark's Plumbing. I've been plumbing for about 1974, so I've been a long time. Any questions?
Yeah, my first question is and thank you both. Is it Wobig?
Yes.
When they said rocks, I thought rocks the size I could skip across the pond. So, yeah, I was thinking big rocks.
It's gravel. It's like
bang.
sand and gravel that you put around the water mains and around the water services. So if they broke up line, they're on the downhill side. So it was up here where it's breaking from there. And so the flushing of the main, probably when you do that, after you do the service and shut down and fix the leak, you got to go down on the bottom and try to get everything flushed. So I don't know what hydrant they open up to flush down, but definitely it came on the lower end. Out of all my years of plumbing, I never seen gravel ever come up. That means there's something in the line itself that came up through there.
Sorry, but I'm still a little bit on the size. Pea gravel?
Pea gravel,
Or
little pea
smaller?
gravel.
Sand?
And the screen, yeah, sand, I can understand. And basically it went through there, and each time the orifices are smaller on your faucets and everything, so I had to take everything apart, flush it out again. There was so much in the line itself that it continued coming in that I could not get it all flushed out until finally it came flushed through.
There's a little
I
zoom,
just
there's a
put it-
little, there's a little zoom button at the base of
That is for the water washing machine. That's usually come and usually plug up because they got Pacific screens. But the water meter itself, like you said, that if there's a little hole, it'll push through. And I don't know if the system got flushed out, did get flushed out, but did it get flushed out well enough? That's the big question.
Let's get the gravel that's in the bottom of my aquarium.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
That's probably more
Okay.
accurate.
Okay.
Other
Any
questions? Councilwoman Lamb?
So I have a question of the Wobigs, and just because it looked like there was no amount specified for your claim. You told us what your claim was for, but we didn't have an amount.
When I turned in the claim, I did turn in all of the bills that we had. And if we take the 2 bills that we would like to see reimbursement for, and I have those if you would like a copy of those bills from Mark's Plumbing.
Thank you.
Other questions from the council? Councilman Camp.
Yes, Ms. Wolbig talked about a filter screen that had a hole in it, and
For
Mr.
the water meter itself. There's there is so much force. They had about almost 80 pounds of pressure. So on the low end, you're getting high pressure, and it's going to push right up through there and force it through the little hole in the screen or through the screens of the water meter onto it.
Other questions from the council? Thank you both, all 3 of you, for testifying, and we'll go through our agenda items and come back and vote.
Would you like me to submit these to anyone or just hold on to them?
I'd say just hold on to them at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the, yes, thank you.
Chris Connolly, Acting City Attorney. In this situation, there was a broken water main at 5800 North 33rd Street, which I will try and show you here. I don't know how well this will show up, but
Might be some zooming out required too. Nope, maybe not.
right here is where the Wobigs property is. And down here.
Yeah, you will have to zoom out a little bit, yeah. Near the bottom, by your wrist. Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, there you go.
Here is the location of where the water main break was. So you can see there's quite a distance between the two locations. I don't know what that is. I couldn't tell you, but it's quite a distance. It has to wind its way through that neighborhood to get to there. So that occurred on June 22nd. And it appears that the claim arose, I believe, on June 27th. There was contact with Public Works. 2 Public Works employees did go out and look at this. And what they did was they looked at the water meter that was installed. And on the front of the water meter is a screen that's meant to catch debris and rocks and whatever else may go through there. And they were able to get a photo of it. And so this is what they pulled out. And you can see the finger in there that kind of helps with the scale a little bit. But they looked at that screen and they could find no holes in the screen. They also went further and took apart the meter and found no pebbles, no gravel at all in the meter itself. And they see typically that once, if something does penetrate through this screen, they're going to find damage to the meter. There was nothing wrong with the water meter. We don't deny that there were pebbles or rocks or whatever in the hot water heater, but we can't explain how it got there because the screen was intact, appeared to be working, and there was no damage to our meter. And so that's the basis for our denial of the claim.
Questions from the council?
Well,
I'm sorry, Councilwoman Raybold.
I don't know if our plumber could answer the question, but how else would
I think their plumber left the building.
the pebbles get in on the other side?
Yeah, I can't explain it. I mean, was there a break in a line somewhere else that we don't know about? I don't know. And I'm not suggesting there was. I'm just saying we don't know how else it could have gotten there. All we're saying is, we looked at our equipment, everything appeared to be functioning correctly, and so we don't know how it could have gotten there. And if the equipment's functioning correctly, then we're not liable. I mean, I guess that's the bottom line.
I see no other hands go up. I have a quick question. Were there any other homes in the neighborhood that filed
No,
claims or damage?
I'm not aware of any other claims that were made as a result of this.
Other questions from the council? I can see your brain, Councilman Lamb, working.
Well, I guess were the pebbles smaller than the ones on the screen that you showed us? I mean, could they have blasted through the little holes that you see?
Is that a question?
I just am dumbfounded on how the pebbles could get in on the other side.
This is another picture. You know, it's a little closer up. I don't know if that helps you.
I don't know if they were necessarily smaller than the ones on the screen. Our house sits, the picture he showed, I don't know if distance makes any difference. Where our house sits in that picture, the people from the city, they come out, the end of that sewer line is right outside of our house. So we are at the end of that particular line. Whatever line, however the water runs, however the sewer runs, our house does sit right at the end of the line. So when the plumber talks about how the water runs and how we are at the end of the line, how else would rocks get in there? And I understand what your argument is. If things are functioning properly, well, we didn't pour rocks in anything to make it not work. So
when the irrigation initially when our sprinkler system initially blew up out of the ground, and it was out of the ground and we had water flowing all night long, I asked the city person who came out, I said, are we the only ones who had our sprinkler system blown up out of the ground? And he said, it looks to be that way. And I said, why is that? And that's when he explained that our house must be at the end of that line. So when it was turned back on, it came and when it hit that end, which is where our home was, it had nowhere to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you. I think we're done with this.
Any further questions?
Any additional questions?
I do have a question. I'm sorry.
Hang on just a second. Council, everybody freeze. Councilman Gaylor Baird, you're welcome.
So, have we ever seen a claim like this before? I mean, and what is the process of the gravel being put in near water mains? Can we get some info from Public Works on this claim?
Yeah, and Mickey and I visited a little bit before this. We're not aware of how this could have occurred, to be honest with you. I mean, we can certainly ask more questions if that's your wish, but we have no explanation for it. Our equipment was working.
But is there gravel that's placed around water mains? I don't understand. Is there a city use of gravel, is my question. Is there some intentional use near?
Mickey Esposito, Director of Transportation and Utilities. Yes, gravel is typically used around the bedding of, water infrastructure. So, and I think what Chris is just saying is, in order to be liable, there has to be shown negligence, and there has to be a defect within the unit, the meter in this case. We're not seeing that. But we can certainly go back and investigate further if you want us to delay this particular claim and ask some more questions from our witnesses.
Water main breaks happen, and it's never a good thing, and we want them taken care of quickly. But is there a procedure for actually examining if gravel that's around water infrastructure has entered a line? I mean, is there any sort of testing or process that you have, or protocol?
Yes, there are protocols. I don't know them specifically today, but I can certainly get that written out.
Because if it wasn't followed, then
I doubt it wasn't followed. I mean, but we can see what they did when the water main break occurred.
Councilman Christensen has a couple questions.
So what's interesting to me is the water is turned back on the line, and then this system ruptures, the sprinkler system ruptures. It would seem to me, and I don't know, but if I were doing this, I would open some outlet valve at the end of that line, maybe another fire hydrant, and let that absorb all the pressure and then close it up. And then if that had been done, I don't think their lines of their sprinkler system would have ruptured. And clearly, somehow these are connected. Do we do that kind of thing? What's the procedure for putting water back into a line where it's been shut off?
All I can say is that there are procedures. I wasn't prepared to talk through the protocol for flushing a line when a water main break occurs and when we go in and repair. We can certainly get that information to you, and particularly in this case, what kind of protocol was followed. But these guys have been doing this for a number of years, and so my assumption is that they did what they normally do in this circumstance, and it is an unfortunate circumstance, but we can get that information to this council.
Any other questions of these two testifiers before we move on to the remainder of our agenda? I thank you both for coming forward.
Thank you.
And I think we have someone else that would like to talk about a claim against the city.
Bryn Chambers with the University of Nebraska. I'm Associate General Counsel. And I'll thank you for your time, and I won't take long. The university submitted a claim based on a water main break, which occurred on January 18th, 2018. I believe the claim was filed August 13th, 2018. The claim has to do with damage to property at Hewitt Place, the Great Plains Art Museum. So there was a water main ruptured, causing a fairly significant damage to drywall and a little bit of artwork. I'm here because a water main in a similar location caused damage to the building in 2015 as well. Since the water mains are exclusively under control of the city, I don't have much other information than that, other than we do know that, or at least nobody's denied that the water came through a broken water main, and so the university filed that claim. Recommendation has been for denial, and we just asked for a reconsideration.
Questions from this testifier? Would you like to hear from staff or someone else? Please. I'm sorry, I didn't write down your name. Thank you very much for coming forward. Mr.
Chambers.
And you see me a lot today. Chris Connolly, Acting City Attorney. This is a little bit different. He's correct that there were prior breaks on the water line. In fact, this would have been the third, I think, in about the last 5 years. Now, the way this gets treated is HDR did a Water System Facilities Master Plan in 2014 that included a number of recommendations, and one of the things that they talk about in this plan and as part of their recommendations is that with water lines, when they have breaks, since it can happen for any number of reasons, and because it can take so long to replace the appropriate section, it is their recommendation and belief that you really don't have notice, as we understand it, until the third break, which is what this one is. And so Public Works and now Transportation Utilities has been operating under this rule. And in fact, they have since replaced this stretch of water line. We're not sure if it's completely done yet, but it was begun in September of 2018. So once we were put on notice, according to policy developed by experts, the project was moved up, and it is now being addressed perhaps as we speak. And so that's the reason for the recommendation of denial on this claim.
Thank you. Questions from the council? Seeing no one coming. Short rebuttal?
Yeah, I would just question the appropriateness of a policy that requires 3 breaks for notice. If we've got to have notice, seems like, again, I understand that we had an engineering firm look at it, but that seems a little bit punitive for the taxpayers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to come forward and address pending claims against the city? We'll move on to the rest of our agenda item. We come back and vote after that. So, Teresa, our next item
is 5C, waiver 18006, application of Christ Lutheran Church to waive parking lot surfacing requirements at 6700 Chatsworth Lane.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Melbourne. I live at 2440 North 78th Street here in Lincoln, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Oh, Mr. Melbourne.
Christ Lincoln, our central locations at 44th and Sumner. We average over 2,000 attendees a week in worship and numerous other activities that go on all week, and these activities continue to grow. There's limited growth capacity at Central, and because of that, we're trying to serve the city of Lincoln better by looking for other locations. About 3 years ago, about 180 people went south, and they've been worshiping at Lincoln Christian High School in the gymnasium, and we're grown now past 200 to 300 there. And it's time for us to move to a permanent facility to grow, to continue that growth. That's at 6700 Chatsworth Lane, the property you have there. And we chose that property because of how fast South Lincoln is growing. And the initial building will include a multi-purpose space, gymnasium-like, and then childcare preschool will be included with that building as well. The multi-purpose space will accommodate approximately 400 people, so we can grow another 100 in that space. And when that capacity is met, a second phase building will provide permanent worship space and be constructed to handle larger capacity. That building will be built on the location of where we're starting this existing parking lot for the first part of the building. So with me this afternoon, I've got Tim Gergen with Clark Enerson, who can give you some of the technical details of that.
Good afternoon. On the screen right here, you have the first phase of the church project. This is in the Village Meadows neighborhood, located near 70th and Yankee Hill Road. This is the parking lot that we are building here today, and it's not necessarily a waiver to build less than the parking stalls required. It's necessarily a waiver to not pave the parking lots that is required. This is the future build-out phase, and this future build-out's expected that phase 2 is happen to happen within 5 years of the project. And as you can see, the difference between the first phase and the ultimate phase is the south parking lot. So during the first phase of the construction, the main entry of the buildings can be mainly centered towards the south side. So we want to put our parking lot towards the main entry. However, our future build-out is where the future sanctuary is going to be. So we'd really not like to pave a parking lot until our future phase is, because that parking lot will be torn out and ripped out. So we'd like to just park it at this time, rock it at this time, and then when we have the future phase, we would pave the entire parking lot. So our request for waiver is simply to not pave a parking lot for a period of 5 years. If the future phase does not happen, or if it gets delayed more than 5 years, we are going to pave the parking lot instead of keep it as rock. We have discussed this with city staff, with Building and Safety and Planning Department, and they were in support of this waiver, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions from the council?
Yes, Mr. Gergen, does the waiver include that both sides of the south park there, I think on the first drawing?
Yeah, so this is our first phase here. So this is the first phase of the building. What's going to be highlighted is what we're going to pave today. So we're going to pave our entrance drive, pave the handicap stalls, and pave the access drive aisles, but just not the parking lots. This is going to be the drop-off lane for the daycare, so that will all be paved. The handicap stalls will be paved. It's just this part will be rock. So when we come in for the future edition, which will be this lightly bolded orange line, that way we don't have to tear up the existing parking lot and repave it all over again.
Are you going to leave rock on the area that has the perimeter?
Right, so this part will be rock here, and this part will be rock in here.
And so the latter part, you just designate you'd rock, or you'd pave that when you did the 5-year extension?
That's correct. So our intention is to pave everything when we're in 5 years, and not have any rock parking.
Other questions from the council? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Carey, would you please answer a few questions, yield to a few questions?
Good afternoon, David Carey with the Planning Department.
Yes, it was implied that the Planning Department had reviewed this and saw no problems?
Correct. This is fairly typical, especially for new church sites or church sites that are trying to expand, especially their parking areas. So this is typical. We have some delay in the pavement. Allows them sometimes to either do fundraising or, in this case, to phase improvements, which makes sense to us. Plus, there is a condition of approval that does require the paving after the 5 years if the growth phasing does not materialize, as Mr. Gergen just said, that they would then pave the parking.
So, and that part's what I'd like to have a second question on. Is there parking lot police that go out and make sure at the end of 5 years that this is done? How does that happen?
I wouldn't say there's parking lot police out there, but this is one of those sites that's fairly visible. I think it's something that we would see throughout the community, and it's something that we would be able to follow up on. I don't have a concern about that.
I understand. Thank you. Other questions from the council?
Can we deputize Benny? Can he go out and do that?
I'm sure he has little else to do, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the chamber that would like to speak on this agenda item? Seeing no one, our next item?
Is item 5D, approving an interlocal agreement between the city and the RTSD for participation in the North 48th Street Underpass study.
Hi, my name is Danielle Vockel. I'm an engineer with Lincoln Transportation and Utilities. I'm the project manager for this study and thought I'd give you a little history or a little information about the project. We're currently working with a consulting firm to do this study, which will evaluate the intersection of 48th and Cornhusker Highway, and then also evaluate the railroad bridge and the roadway that crosses underneath it. This study will then give us a little bit more information and insight when we try to do our future budgeting for the future LRTP. When we go to widen 48th Street or do the improvements of 48th Street between Adams and Superior.
I understand. Questions from the council?
No, but I got distracted by the first person ever coming up and say, I work for LTU. No, thank you for the work on this. It's obviously a long-term project.
Absolutely.
Highly anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
Councilman, I saw you doing.
Well, it's a perennial problem. Whenever it rains, very much at all, it's, we've got one of our bigger lakes in the city right there. So, so it needs attention.
Correct.
Other questions from the council? Danielle, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone in the audience who would like to testify on this agenda item? Well, thank you all. Teresa, I think we're at the end.
All right, we can
of our
vote on these
resolutions.
items then. Item 5A is declaring the official intent of the city to reimburse certain expenses in connection with acquiring, constructing, equipping, and furnishing wastewater improvements from the proceeds of bonds issued by the city, introduced by Raybold.
So moved.
Second.
You have a motion by Councilwoman Raybold and a second by Councilman Eskridge. Discussion? Hearing none, would you call the roll, please?
Camp,
Yes.
Christensen,
Yes.
Eskridge.
Yes.
Gaylor Baird,
Yes.
Lamb,
Yes.
Raybold,
Yes.
Schob.
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0. 5B is the report of claims for the period of December 1st through 31st, introduced by Raybold.
So moved.
Second.
You have a motion by Councilwoman Raybold and a second by Councilman Eskridge. Discussion? Councilwoman Lamb.
Yes, thank you. I would like to move that we delay pull from this claims, the WOBIG claim, in order to allow the further investigation that the Department of Transportation Department head talked to us about.
Second.
You have a motion by Councilwoman Lamb and a second by Councilwoman Gaylor Baird. Discussion of the motion to pull? Hearing none, would you call the roll, please?
Camp,
Yes.
Christensen,
Yes.
Eskridge,
Yes.
Gaylor Baird,
Yes.
Lamb,
Yes.
Raybold,
Yes.
Schob.
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0.
We're back to our Councilwoman Raybold.
I have a question. I believe that, is Ms. Schroeder in the audience? Yes. Weren't we going to get more information from the arborist on this claim? Would staff like to come up and talk about that one? I'm sorry, I just assumed that that was going to get addressed.
Thank you, Councilwoman.
Chris Conway, Acting City Attorney. We did get some additional information, and Lynn Johnson, I think, will share some of it with you. But I think the bottom line is that we do have a history that shows that there weren't problems with this tree, and had there been an inspection of the tree at some point at or near the time of the damage, it would not have indicated that there was a hollow trunk or anything. In fact, This is one example of what the tree looked like at the time after it was cut. And I can tell you that the rest of the trunk going up looked similar. And what I think Lynn will tell you here in just a second is that the tree was cut down not because of it was dangerous. It was cut down because it's a silver maple, which is a tree that is not put in by the city. There's no history of the city of planting silver maples. And since they saw a silver maple, they decided to take it down, but not because it was dangerous. Lynn, I don't know if you want to expound on that further a little bit.
No, absolutely. I'd be happy to. We maintain a list of trees that are not allowed in the public right-of-way, and typically they're trees that are weak-wooded and are not suitable long-term to be within the public right-of-way. Silver maple is one of those trees, and as Mr. Conley said, this tree was not identified for removal because of any defect that had been identified within it. It was identified for removal because it was a silver maple. Anytime a citizen requests that a silver maple street tree be removed, we will remove that tree. And as Mr. Conley said, we don't know that at any time the city planted silver maples. It's a fast-growing tree. There's a lot of them throughout the community. This silver maple actually was in reasonably good condition for its age. What happened with this tree in October is exactly why we don't allow silver maples in the public right-of-way. The snowstorm, and with that tree being in full leaf at that time, that weak-wooded tree, it dropped a couple of branches out of it. There were 6 calls for service between September 21st and November 3rd. Limbs fell out of the tree twice, once on October 14th, one October 22nd. Certainly one of those, and I would guess both of those, were related to the storm event. On November 2nd, there was an activity request submitted to remove the tree, and as I say, the request for removal was not because the tree was in hazardous condition. It was just because of the species that it is, and it's not a variety that's allowed in the public right-of-way. And the tree removal began on December 14th and finished on December 11th. And I think, as I mentioned the last time, under normal conditions, we're about 60 days out on routine work. So the initial request on September 21st was to trim that tree. So unless there was some sort of emergency, if there had been a request that there was something significant, we would have gone out and inspected it right away. We would have taken care of it right away. But a routine trim request is about 60 days. So 60 days out from the 21st of September would have been about the 21st of November. And by that time, the plan was to take the tree down. And I can show you a couple of additional photos if that would help. This is the same photo that Mr. Conley has of the tree trunk. The trunk was about 5 feet by about 4.5 feet in diameter. It was a very large trunk. You can see the trunk is absolutely solid. The stump is absolutely solid. This is a photograph of the trunk of that tree. The tree was numbered 454. We went out to the yard where this trunk had been hauled. This is the trunk of tree number 454. The stump of that tree, or pardon me, the trunk of that tree was absolutely solid as well. This is a little bit further up the tree, and one of the what's called codominant leaders did have a hollow spot within the center of it. And I think there was testimony at the last city council meeting was that one of the arborists referenced that hollow spot in the tree, and it was in fact hollow. But there is enough solid wood on the outside of that hollow spot for that trunk to have been, or for that leader to be solid and stable. So, and there was no sign on the outside of that tree, which is not uncommon for silver maple, but there were no indications on the outside of that tree that hollow condition existed within the stump. So I do apologize. 6 calls for service on one tree is significant. We were working through a backlog of calls. Normally it wouldn't have taken that long to get out there, but I think what happened with this tree was exactly what should have happened. It should have been reviewed. Because it's a silver maple, and if the property owner requested removal, we should have taken it down, and we got it taken down within about 6 weeks of the time that it was identified for removal.
And again, with the idea being that we have a reasonable amount of time to fix the problem or cure the defect, whatever the issue is, given the scope and or not the size of the number of crews that Parks has available for this kind of work, and given the size of the storm that actually occurred on September 1st and then later in October, the crews are overwhelmed. This is not something that they can prepare for. It certainly doesn't make any financial sense to gear up and have enough crews just standing by waiting for these kinds of opportunities. And so having some extra time before some trees can be trimmed or removed because they may be dangerous, and in this case it really wasn't a danger situation, we think is a good reason for denying the claim.
Councilwoman Raybould?
I seem to recall that one of the concerns that were raised by the neighbors is that the limbs were falling where children were walking home from school.
Yeah, I checked that with the woman at our reception desk who you actually met earlier this afternoon, Janet Ball. Janet normally takes very good notes of the calls when they come in. She doesn't have any record that there was any notation of children walking in that area. If there had been that kind of notation, if that had been mentioned to her, that would have been in the notes. And we certainly have a request to check the tree to see if it needed to be trimmed or possibly removed. Janet doesn't have any recollection of the call indicating that there were children walking in the area, and there's nothing in the notes from that call either to indicate that.
Did the Schroders present receipts for the damages that they're asking to be reimbursed for?
My understanding is that the $2,000 was the total cost, but their insurance paid for, I believe, most of this. And I could be wrong on that. But it's roughly $2,000, I believe, is what they're requesting. And it may be about I'm not sure what the deductible was. $500 may have been the deductible. $1,000 deductible. And so some of this is money out of pocket for her, but some of it is not.
So I'm still confused. The total amount requested was $2,200?
I believe that's correct. Looking for the page that has the actual dollar amount.
$2,262.
$2,200.62, yes.
So I'm not sure what that represents if they have a $1,000 deductible.
If they have a $1,000 deductible, that would have been what they paid out of pocket for this, and their insurance company paid for the balance. My understanding.
Go ahead, Councilwoman Gaylord Baird. Sorry, were you finished? And we are kind of in the middle of a voting session. This is a little bit weird.
No, we should have done this during.
Reopen public hearing so we can have the Schroders come up.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilman Camp, second by Councilman Christensen to reopen public hearing on this item. And then we'd like to invite the Schroders to
take a call.
To vote.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Yes.
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb?
Yes.
Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried to reopen.
Thank you. And would you like to come up and testify on the agenda item?
I still have
I'm sorry.
question for staff. Sorry.
Mr.
Now,
Johnson,
do you
would
want to
come
hear
back
from
up
them
and
as
yield to-
well?
Yeah. Councilwoman Gaylord Baird, please.
So could you put the timeline of recorded requests for service on the screen?
Yeah, and I'll have to apologize because it has my notes on it.
I might have a clean one. Let's see.
This is the entire tree history on that tree dating back to 2004. The initial request this year was on September 21st of 2018, and it was a call to request that the tree be inspected and trimmed. And as I noted, the property owner's daughter at the last meeting indicated that when that call came in, indicated that a limb had fallen where children were walking, and that's the one where our staff notes don't indicate that was the case.
I'm curious if when you get two calls so close together that there is any sort of urgency attached to a particular request for service, or if there are any notes about why they called again within 2 weeks. To me, it suggests urgency.
That is a good question. After a storm event, we'll get multiple calls on the same tree, that people are concerned that they aren't seeing action. And so I think that's what was going on here.
Well, I want to clarify that these are two calls prior to the storm,
yeah,
really close together.
And the staff were still responding to the Labor Day storm at that time. And so they were scrambling to get caught up at that point. And 6 calls on one tree, I will admit, is a lot. It is not uncommon for there to be multiple calls. And I think, as I indicated, that multiple calls don't, unless it's a hanger or unless it's something in the call that indicates that it's a hazardous condition, a limb on the ground would not be considered to be a high priority. A limb that's broken off and hanging over a sidewalk or hanging out over private property, that would be given immediate attention.
Councilwoman Raybold.
Well, I know we've just had a discussion of the tree being a silver maple, and that's on the list of trees that should not be planted in the right-of-way. But knowing that, why wouldn't you have taken the tree down a lot sooner then?
It's really, it's probably resources. The tree actually was in reasonably good condition. When we'd seen the tree previously, there hadn't been any indication that there were problems with it. And we don't proactively go out and try to take down silver maples. It really is in response to the adjoining property owner contacting us and saying, I have a concern about this tree, will you please check it, and if it's appropriate, take the tree down.
But it seems it has quite a record of calls and service.
Yeah, back in 2004, the tree was trimmed. The tree was inspected at that time, and it had recently been trimmed. In 2012, there was a hanger, and actually there's a street view photo here of the tree. And coincidentally, this photo is from that same period, and you can see where that branch, where that hanger was at that time. So there was a hanger removed at that time. The form of the tree for silver maple is actually in pretty good shape. There was a request for some trimming around a satellite dish. There was a suggestion that we don't trim to open up sight lines for satellite dish, and there was an offer to issue a permit to have the tree trimmed, that the city staff would not do it. There is a note in our files in 2017 about that there were roots in the sanitary sewer. We don't have any documentation about how those roots were addressed. And then from there on, beginning on September 2018 of this year, is the chronology of the series of 6 phone calls and the 2 limbs coming down, and then ultimately the tree being removed.
Councilwoman Gaylor-Baird.
How long have you been quick to remove silver maples? Like, how long has that been a policy?
I think that's a fairly standard policy. That's been an ongoing policy for a number of years. The one thing that we have today that we didn't really have until June of about a year ago is we now know the locations of all the silver maples in this city. So previously we didn't have an inventory that would have told us the location of those. I meant to bring a list of total how many silver maples we have in the public right-of-way. I can certainly provide that information.
When you have arborists, whether they're city or city contracted, and they are called out, as this one, this tree was spurring requests for service not that long ago, 2016, there were 2 calls, 2017 roots, and did no one make a note of the fact that it was a silver maple? Would that have not triggered a discussion around removing it from the right-of-way at that point?
It's a good question. My understanding is that really, if the staff note that the tree is in poor condition, they may recommend to the adjoining property owner that the tree be taken down. In this case, it was a silver maple that was not truly in poor condition. Or if the adjoining property owner is saying, you know, I have concerns about that tree, I'd like to see it removed. So your question about how proactive we are, a lot of times I can't tell you the history of this tree and whether the adjoining property owner felt strongly about trying to just keep it in good shape, and if it was just recently there was a concern about taking it down or not.
What's the policy today if you find a silver maple in the right of way? Do you take it down right away? No, I mean.
If it's in failing condition, we'll talk to the adjoining property owner and we will let them know that we'd like to take it down. If it's in good condition, we would probably leave it in place just because of the resources that it takes to take a tree down. If the adjoining property owner contacts us and says, or if while we're there doing work, if the homeowner says, you know, I'm concerned about that tree, then there's probably a conversation that goes on about would you be willing to allow us to take it down? At that point, we would take the tree down. It's a conversation going on between our staff and the adjoining property owner about how important that tree is to the adjoining property owner.
Other questions from the council? Thank you, Councilwoman. So we've reopened the public hearing for this one item. We've heard from staff. We've heard from the complainants, applicants, residents.
We haven't.
From them now. We have not? Okay. This is why I went through the checklist. Would you like to come forward and talk about your claim against the city again?
I'm Amy Filbert. My mom, Carol Schroeder, owns the house on 1506B. This is Todd Diekman. He is the tenant there. And there were children walking, and Todd actually called us, and he said, there's some kids from McPhee, and a limb fell, and that's when I called in September. So.
And plus, we have a daycare across the street, so parents park there to pick their kids up. And I've lived there for 5.5 years. Every storm, I mean, we're talking big branches. We're not talking small branches. So.
Other questions from the council? I'm sorry, I was looking.
If we could have a clarification, is the 2,000?
Thank you.
The 2,200, is that before or after the insurance reimbursement?
That's total.
I'm sorry?
That's the total amount.
So 1,000 of it would have been paid for by the insurance company?
Would not have.
Yes.
Okay, so it's $1,200 out of pocket.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And then I had Connor Roofing, and he did the roof. Everything was $1,300. And back in 2016, we actually wanted that tree removed. And then when Todd had issues with the satellite, and we wanted to trim it, he wanted to trim it himself, and they said, you can't, it's a city tree. So we just left it. And I said, could you come out and trim it? And he said, well, no, we're not going to. And then I think it was a few weeks later, we called again, and they came out. But they seemed like they never wanted to come out and take care of that tree.
Councilwoman Raybould, did you have some additional questions?
Well, I have to be honest, I am still confused about the amount that you want reimbursed. If you have a $1,000 deductible that you're responsible for.
Actually, my mom doesn't want it to go again because there's more damage, but she has to fix. Just the roof alone was $1,300. So the total amount, I wish I would have brought my paperwork in. It was
$2,262.
Right.
Okay. So you're saying that in that amount is the additional amount for roof repair?
She had that repaired. Her deductible is $1,000. The roof came to $1,300. So what my mom's wanting, she doesn't want to pay anything over out of pocket, and she doesn't want her rates to go up. So that's why we want you guys to the city to take care of what she had to pay out of pocket. Because she still has to repair the fence. There's other things that she hasn't done yet. So what was that amount? Somebody said it earlier.
62 cents.
Right, minus $1,000, but she still has more work to do. So she wants to be repaid back for what she's paying out of pocket. So that would be.
Other questions from the council? $2,200 is what you're requesting in damages. I'm thinking the insurance company.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to make a motion, we remove this and let them get the exact figures and information to the city attorney.
Second.
So I'm going to stick on this end of the Chamber, motion by Councilman Camp, second by Councilwoman Raybold to have this item removed from the list of pending claims against the city for further research.
And get more detailed.
That means you would provide us with the exact numbers.
Okay.
And what the insurance company, including what the insurance company has paid and what they haven't paid, which is the deductible.
Okay.
Okay? That's what we expect to receive, right?
So we have a motion and second on that, and we're ready for a roll call vote on that?
If I can add, it sounds like there are even other repairs she wants. Everything needs to be bundled together in one
Okay.
claim, and then we can evaluate that rather
I
than.
wish I could go out to my car. I have it all in there.
We need to move on with other
Yeah.
business.
Yep.
So we have a motion and a second, and we're ready for a vote. Please call the roll.
Camp?
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb?
Yes.
Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0.
So, thank you very much. We'll
go back to our voting session.
We're going back to our regular agenda now. Nothing will happen today. You'll please bring some more information to the city,
Okay.
to the city attorney's office, and we'll deal with this at a future meeting.
Bring it to the next meeting.
I don't think it'll be the
When-
next meeting,
When
no.
city attorney notifies you of the
Okay.
next time it'll be here.
Thank you.
The main motion is.
So now we need to vote on the main motion.
Yes.
Camp?
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb?
Yes.
Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0. 5C is the waiver for Christ Lutheran Church, introduced by Raybold.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion by Councilwoman Raybold, second by Councilman Eskridge over here to my right. Any other discussion? Would you call the roll, please?
Camp?
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb? Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0. Item 5D is the interlocal agreement with the RTSD, introduced by Raybold.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion by Raybold, second by Eskridge. Discussion? Please call the roll.
Camp?
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb?
Yes.
Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0. Next then are our public hearing ordinances, second reading. Item 6A is change of zone 18030, application of Robert Grimmett for a change from AG Agricultural to AGR Agricultural Residential on property generally located at 6705 West Van Dorn Street.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the council. Excuse me, I'm Mark Hunziker, appearing on behalf of Green Estates LLC. My partner, Bob Grimmett, is one of the members, or his wife is one of the members of the LLC. It's a family-held LLC which is holding this farmland and wants to change the zoning from AG to AGR. The property is located on West Van Dorn Street at about Southwest 70th Street. And the staff report makes a great deal of the idea that acreage development somehow hinders urban expansion. And because acreage owners have objected to annexation in the past, that no more acreage development should be approved within any future urban growth tiers. I want to make several points about that. First of all is it's a fallacy that acreage development has been developed in a planned way, in any meaningful sense of that word. Secondly, most acreage developments which have been annexed and planned were developed in places the planning department encouraged for the very purpose of hindering urban expansion. The acreage owners have always objected to annexation. It has been and ever will be. But there is no acreage development which has successfully argued against annexation when it's been proposed by the staff. And finally, the urban growth tiers in the comprehensive plan are huge. They encompass vast amounts of land which are way more than adequate to accommodate all future urban expansion as well as acreage development that is foreseeable in this county. Back to the the point that acreage development has not been done in a very planned way. If you look at the comprehensive plan future land use map, you can see that there are yellow areas all over the county, up in the north area, northeast, southeast, southwest, west. All these yellow areas are areas where acreage developments have been or are occurring throughout the county. And I promise you those areas were not painted yellow prior to the time they were actually zoned AGR. The areas that are in fact developed and have been developed as acreages have generally been opposed by the planning department regardless of their location, with the exception of a couple where the planning department deliberately, at say 56th and Highway 2, where you have Country Meadows, the planning department deliberately showed an AGR acreage area there in order to stop expansion of the city to the southeast. Now that predates almost all of you. Almost. Some of you may be old enough to remember that, but probably don't. But the fact of the matter is that the area in that quadrant of 56th and Highway 2 was deliberately planned to put a stop to urban expansion, and the acreages were developed as part of that plan. The acreage owners, again, have always objected to annexation. I don't recall one where it's been a happy circumstance for the acreage owners anywhere. On the other hand, there has never been an acreage proposed for annexation which has not been annexed. Tier 1 of the comprehensive plan's growth plan, 1 minute, it's okay, is within the dotted line on this map, and you can see that there are several acreage areas included. That Tier 1 includes enough land between tiers 1, 2, and 3, let's put it this way, are large enough to accommodate over 350,000 dwelling units and 834,000 people, according to the assumptions in the comprehensive plan, by sometime after 2060. Now, the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city of Lincoln was established so that you can plan for that area, but it was not established for the purpose of imposing unreasonable requirements on everyone who owns land within that 3-mile jurisdiction, that they simply be on hold and not be able to do anything but farm their land until 50 years pass. And I would suggest to you that for property like this, which is marginally productive farmland, which is now, by virtue of deaths in the family, divided up among several family members, and barely, producing enough product to pay the taxes and to maintain it, it ought to be where you have a situation like this, where a budding property on two sides is developed for acreages, that this property ought to be able to be zoned and developed that way as well. There's plenty of water, there's paved roads, and it's way out there at the far end of Tier 3 of urban development, which is not going to get in your way in any meaningful time frame that anyone in this room will either remember or care about. I'd try to answer any questions you may have.
I think Councilman Eskridge is up.
Yes. So, Mark, the development, not immediately west, but even farther west, where the lots look like they're a lot smaller. Can you describe?
That's a little bit off our screen, Mr. Hunsinger. If
I'm
you
sorry.
drag that a little
Here
bit.
you go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Is
so,
that better?
yeah, explain what is it that your client wants to do with their property? Is it the one immediately next to them, or is it the one farther to the west?
The current plan is to do something more along the lines of what's immediately next to them. the 3-acre lot sizes. I mean, we have build-through standards which are now required for all AGR type development.
Right.
And we would propose to do a build-through type subdivision of 3-acre plus size lots with subplots within each of those 3 acres where houses would be required to be located so that sometime after 2060 or 2070 or whenever it might be, and the city gets out to this point and wants to annex and put sewer and water through, that there will be the ability of those owners to subdivide and utilize the city services in the way that others have. I mean, I'm trying to remember the name of the subdivision on North 84th Street. Just east of 84th, south of Holdridge, there's an acreage development whose name I can't say right at the moment, that was done by Hub Hall, and it was the first one that was ever done that way, where we didn't have any standards. We pretty much invented the concept of saying, okay, we're going to have 3 envelopes for houses on each of these lots, and so that when it gets annexed, there will be an ability to re-subdivide and urbanize this area. And that's what we have now for all acreage subdivisions.
Thank you.
Other questions from the council? Councilwoman Raybold.
Mark, are your clients amenable to having it as a CUP so that it has that flexibility of, offering acreages, but?
It very well could be. I mean, our purpose here today is to try and get the zoning in place so that it's attractive to a potential developer to do something along those lines. It's not. This is a site that lays out reasonably well for 3-acre lots, but somebody who wanted to do something a little more inventive, I suppose, could do a community unit plan. And either way, under the build-through standards, you can provide for those areas to be integrated into the urban development.
Other questions from the council? Would it be appropriate to have Mr. Carey come forward and speak for a moment? Thank you, Mr. Hunsinger. Sure. Don't go too far.
Nope, not evening yet. Good afternoon, David Carey with the Planning Department.
It feels like it's been a long meeting, but it really hasn't yet.
Not yet.
So, acreages. Good thing, bad thing? Will they hamper growth? Can we work them into the system? Explain to me help me understand.
Sure. I think the way that we look at acreages is a matter of the location. Mr. Hunsinger provided some information on some of the history of what has happened with some of these acreage developments throughout the community. Our suggestion of denial of this is based on the fact of the location of this proposal. And it has a lot to do with the fact that it is within our growth tiers. There have been decisions made in the past where we have approved a lot of these acreage subdivisions and in locations that have gotten in the way of our current growth of the city. Many of you were part of, or not all of you, were part of the recent annexation study and then package that came through in 2017. The decisions that were made as part of that package actually came to full fruition just in December, where the full annexation of some of those areas that we allowed for some time to adjust to the change in the school district boundaries and things like that. Those are tough processes, and I'm not here to say that they should be easy, because they're not. We're talking about people's properties, but what happens is that if we start to approve these acreages too close to the city as it exists today, even though today it looks like it's very far beyond where we're going to be in the near future. The fact is that this location is just 1.5 miles beyond our current city limits. It also is within the Haynes branch of our drainage system, which, as we know, is how we plan our sewer system. I am not here to be a soothsayer and say that this area will be in our next plan. But what we will be doing is adding 10 years to our horizon year in the next comprehensive plan update out to 2050. And that seems like a long ways away. That's over 30 years away. But we will be proactively planning for those areas. And it is possible that this branch of the Haynes branch could be discussed seriously to come in. And even if it's not decided to come in, it is very likely that it could be part of our growth beyond 2060. Now you say, well, that's 40 years beyond where we are today. That's true, but the areas that we just annexed in 2017, and I'll list them out if we remember, the Hillcrest Heights, Sunrise Estates, Dunroven Acres, Portia Heights, those were all done back in the 60s and 70s, 50 and 40 years ago. Seemed like a long ways in the future at that time. But the fact is that we literally have grown all the way around all of those or right up against them. And that's where some of that friction starts to happen. So when it comes down to acreages being good or bad thing, there is a demand out there for acreages. We're not saying that there isn't. What we're saying is that this location is not the best location for those, that type of housing choice at this point in time. We feel like it's got a higher and better use in the long term to have full urban services eventually. It is within our growth tier structure. And I also point out that there is an option that is available to this property owner, and it's called the Ag CUP. It's not as many lots that would otherwise be available to them if it became AGR, but there would be an opportunity for 12 units, up to 12 units, if they were put on a community sewage system that is available to them with the current zoning. So the idea here is that this is not an unreasonable expectation. They do have some developable rights on the property, but for the benefit of the community, to be a pro-growth community, we feel like we should be reserving the majority of this land for that urbanized area, even if it is 50 years down the road. That's what our plan is trying to do, is retain that. And so we talk about, how big is our community going to be? Could it be 800,000? It certainly could be. It's not going to be 800,000 in the next 50 years. But our current plan shows us approaching 400,000. We're currently up about getting close to 300,000. When you start adding 10, 20, 30 years to our plan, you're talking about a 100,000 person jump when you start to add many decades to this plan. And so these types of areas we should be preserving for that purpose. And that is what that recommendation of denial is coming from.
Thank you. Other questions from the council?
Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Carey. Is there anyone else in the chamber that would like to speak on this item? Rebuttal? Yep. I think that's where we are.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's kind of interesting that we talk about Sunrise Estates and Hillcrest again. Both of those happen to be at the top edge of the Stevens Creek watershed. And when they were approved, they were out of the way, and they still are, because you come up from the low end of the watershed to the top with the sewer, and so they've been out of the way for all that time, and they're now finally being incorporated into the city. Country Meadows, on the other hand, was deliberately put there in order to stop urbanization, and it accomplished that for a time. It's now part of the city as it ought to be. And again, nobody was successful in arguing against those annexations. Just for perspective, the fact that these are in future urban growth tiers does not mean that future urbanization is imminent. Tier 1, all by itself, will accommodate 40,000 dwelling units and an additional 106,000 population by 2040. Tier 2 is yet another 34 square miles that will accommodate, and the anticipation is, the assumption is that by 2060, it will accommodate another 111,000 people and about 42,000 dwelling units, and leave about 12 sections, or almost 7,700 acres, still available in Tier 2 for development beyond 2060. Tier 3, which is where this property is, and it's at the top of the watershed in Tier 3, by the way. If we get that phasing map out here again. back this up just a little bit. Top of this Tier 3 watershed is out here. And this property is located right here. I would suggest to you that if you're going to pick a place that's not going to be in the way of urban development, this is about as good as it gets. You're way out there from any possible urban development at that location. I mean, beyond 2060. And so the question really becomes, how fair is it to a property owner who's got a farm that's now divided up 3 or 4 different ways among family members and barely producing enough to pay taxes? How fair is it to say to those people, sorry, you have to wait till your grandkids can realize the value of this land because we've put you in Tier 3 of our future urban growth pattern for the city of Lincoln? That's a very, very onerous and unfair restriction on this property. We think it's a good development, a good property to develop for agricultural residential uses, and it can be done in a way that can be incorporated into the city at such time as the city gets there, whenever that might be. But I think it's very clear on the face of the planning documents that are available that it's going to be a long time. I try to answer any questions you might have.
Do we have any questions for this rebuttal testimony?
Thank you.
Again, thank you. We're still in public hearing on ordinances on second reading and related.
Nope.
What?
6C and D.
Yeah, we need to, what's our next item would be the next?
Item 6B, street name change 18001, renaming Cattle Drive, located in the Prairie Village North subdivision as Settlers Lane, and renaming Discovery Drive, located in the University of Nebraska Technology Park subdivision in the Highlands, as Cattle Drive.
Chairman and Lincoln City Council members, my name is Jacob Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R. I live at 2669 County Road N, Weston, Nebraska, on a small family farm, and I'm here to testify in support of this proposal. I currently serve as the Vice Chairman of the Natural Resources Committee for Nebraska Cattlemen, and I've also been a member of our Building Committee. The history of our organization dates back to the 1800s, and for the last 30 years, we've rented space here in the city of Lincoln. Currently, our office is just across the street. We recently made a commitment to our future and purchased a property to be our permanent home. We anticipate the completion of our building in the coming weeks and are looking to move in late in February. As a grassroots organization made up of over 3,000 members from across the state, we rely on our membership to guide our direction, and as such, the genesis for the proposed name change came as a result of a discussion started by one of our members. We are requesting the name change because Cattle Drive underscores what we are about. It acknowledges the largest sector of our state's top industry, and we feel it will be helpful to members and visitors alike when finding our new home. We recognize that having an existing cattle drive complicates our request, but we feel that there is support from the various stakeholders to make this change happen. On behalf of all the members of Nebraska Cattlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to address you today and would try and answer any questions you might have for me.
Thank you, Mr. Weston. Questions from the council? Councilman Christians.
Mr. Mayor, why are you wearing a hat?
Because I feel a lot more comfortable in a hat than a tie.
All right. Well, when I grew up, I was told that wearing a hat in a public building was a sign of disrespect. So I would encourage you to reconsider in your future choice of attire when you come before a body like this.
Duly noted.
Councilman Kemp,
Well,
did you have
I'd
a
like,
question?
just to get everything on the table, we have a motion amendment number 1, just to correct or to change the legislation, and I'd make a motion to move, I'd move we make that motion.
We still in public hearing?
Yes, we are in public hearing.
Public hearing, yeah.
So that's a little bit early, is it?
Mm-hmm.
So we're just wanting to discuss the amendment while we're having public hearing, right?
Right,
That way?
well, okay,
Okay.
call it there, just to
Let
clarify.
me ask, is there anyone else in the chamber who'd like to testify on this item?
Good evening, good afternoon. My name is Mark Suleiman. That's Suleiman. I'm the owner of record of the Nebraska Technology Park. My address is 4665 Innovation Drive. I wanted to speak in support of the proposed change to Cattle Drive from Discovery Drive. I bought the Technology Park in December of 2015. I bought it from the University of Nebraska. The University of Nebraska had a very good vision for this technology park, and one vision that I think we're starting to see come to light at Innovation Campus, a little bit closer to City Campus. Geography would have it that a sale was appropriate at the time, and I had the resources to accomplish that. When I came into the technology park, I think a lot of its success is based on a community effort. That community was largely educational based, and a lot of members of that community left and created a good amount of vacancy. My first order as a young developer trying to find a good way to develop this long empty spot of Northwest Lincoln was to encourage other members of my community to come together. Nebraska Cattlemen in a lot of ways are members of my community. I hail from Kearney, and I still represent that 308, but I've been a member of Lincoln and happy to be here for the last 10 years. This development and its success as of recent would not be possible. Am I in trouble?
Keep
Okay.
talking.
You're okay.
Keep talking.
Would not be possible without the Cattlemen's leadership. These are the first group of people who decided as an organization to take a risk on a part of Northwest Lincoln that needs to be developed and infilled. I know that's a priority that we all share. And, you know, when looking at the scope of the technology park and future development, it's important to welcome groups like this to encourage additional development, not just for myself as a developer, but from other organizations who seek to get ground and build their own projects. I think this is a project that you can get behind, and I surely appreciate your support on their behalf. If you have any questions or concerns related to the development or this request, I'd be happy to answer them.
Councilman Eskridge.
Yes, I know from some other developers who've tried to change the names of roads that can be a challenge. Can you talk a little bit about the process that you've gone through, and have you met all the, do you have the approval of the Postal Service and Building and Safety and all the others that
Sure.
have
Related,
issues about that?
Sure. Related to the specific request, the cattlemen themselves might be a little bit more tuned in on the paperwork. I'm just here in support of that request.
Okay.
Related to the process, from my personal experience, it's there's some red tape associated with it, but everybody's been helpful at every level. When I have questions, they're willing to give me some good answers and give me some good feedback. This is actually the first time that I'm seeing Mr. Carey here, so we usually correspond via my letter to him and vice versa with some of our replat. We're actually on this agenda as well earlier in section 1. So there's additional development in the technology park and this part of Lincoln, and I've had nothing but help from the city to get there, so I really appreciate those efforts.
Okay.
Other questions from the council? Anyone else like to testify on this item? Mr. Carey, I would like to hear from you if you would. We're trying to rename 2 streets?
Yes. David Carey with the Planning Department. Maybe just back up a second, just to.
That would be nice.
I think I can explain what the recommendation of denial, what the meaning is behind that, and then to put in perspective this current proposal. The denial is based on the potential or likelihood that future requests like this would be much more cumbersome than the current one that's in front of you. This one, if you're going to make a name change and if you had to identify the conditions around it, this would be the one that you would want it to be like. You have a limited amount of properties that are impacted in the location of the change to Cattle Drive. The proposed name of Cattle Drive is not specific to a business or an entity. It's more generic, which is what our recommendations and policies say to do. And then actually this makes it a little more complicated in this case, but it's changing a name in a different location in the city that is an existing Cattle Drive over in Prairie Village North. That too is only impacting 4 lots, so it's not, the impact is very limited. The point of denial here is not necessarily against the Cattlemen's Association and the process taken to date in this case. It is more or less to point out that this has the potential, these types of changes have the potential to have a lot of cumbersome nature to it, a lot of costs to city staff and others to make changes to addresses and things like that. It's not necessarily the case here. It's more to put on the record that this is something we want to be very careful with. We do not want to do this very often. I will note that the street name change committee, from that, where we have our Lincoln Fire and Rescue and Police Department that sits on that, they were against it in the sense of that it does potentially provide some confusion for emergency response and building and safety at the same time. They hit the brunt of the actual additional administrative work. I would like to put on record now, just to have for consideration, that as part of this action and part of this proposal, but the fact is that we could benefit from an additional fee if there is in the future, for future proposals like this, that could cover some of those administrative charges. We don't have that proposal in front of you. It's something that we'd like to work on, but it's something to put in your minds as far as what the cost is of some of these things. Again, this particular proposal is probably a shining star example of, if you're going to do it, this is the way to do it. It's also supportive of a significant organization that's coming forward right now that we want to see have success and want to be here in the community. So I'll leave it at that, but that is kind of the background of where the denial comes from, and I can answer any questions that you have.
Councilman Eskridge.
So, David, all the residents and businesses that are on these impacted streets, they've all been contacted, and I don't see anybody here.
Correct.
So
the Cattlemen Association has done a very good job of reaching out, making sure in both locations that there is buy-off on this, okay, and that it's not an issue. I will note, Councilman Camp did bring up that there is a related motion to amend. Originally, there was over in Prairie Village North, the proposal was to change that cattle drive to Mustang Drive, to Settlers Lane. The motion to amend is to change that to Mustang Drive instead of Settlers Lane, mainly because Mustang Drive already exists out there and is a similar location east-west as far as another block, just further to the west, I believe. And so that makes more sense. So that's what that motion to amend is.
Making an extension of Mustang.
It's not really an extension, but it makes sense. It's just a jog, just a bit to the north. So that is what that motion to amend is part of your action if you so choose to approve this name change.
Other questions from staff? For staff, excuse me.
No, but I just want to point out that a couple of these council members that you're looking at have been known to wear hats around the holidays, and so
not in here.
We missed your holiday cat.
Ooh, yes, one of them has. Yeah, you're right.
I can resurrect it very easily.
Mr. Carey, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Would anyone else in the chamber like to speak on this agenda item? Okay, I think it's still too early to take up the motion to amend. We'll do that when we come back and vote. So we're going to item 6C now.
Yes, we'll go on to item 6C and D, text amendment 18014, application of the planning director to amend various Lincoln Municipal Code sections regarding parking requirements, minor adjustments to parking requirements. Then text amendment 18014, application of the planning director to amend Title III, design standards for zoning regulations.
Good afternoon, David Carey with the Planning Department. Here before you on these two items, related items. What we have here are proposed changes to Title III for the city design standards related to parking lot screening and landscaping, and related to zoning code changes related to parking requirements. I'm going to provide you just a real quick kind of big picture view of this and what this is for and what we're here for, and a little bit of process information. Colin Christopher from our office is here to provide you some more detailed information about what is in the proposal, as well as some of the changes that have occurred as part of the process to this point. Basically what this is to provide a balanced package that tries to achieve the point of having increased and better design on our developments, along with allowing for some changes in leniency for parking requirements, both for the on-the-site parking requirements and allowances, as well as some off-site parking provisions here. I will note that part of this package also reorganizes some of our information in our design standards that makes it an easier read, a better way to follow it as well. So there's some kind of formatting changes as well. When we went to the Planning Commission in November, on November 14th, there was a request from our planning commissioners to further discuss this and work with our members of a development community that did make some comments at that hearing saying they do have concerns over this. We did do that. We spent several weeks and had several meetings with several members of the development community Those were constructive in nature. They did provide for some logical changes that we have in our, what actually ended up being acted on at the December 12th meeting. I believe that that has improved the package. It certainly has allowed us to have a more informed discussion with our development community partners, and we are proposing that version of it to you today, and that version was approved by the Planning Commission 7-1. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Colin to provide you some more detailed information about the package and the changes that have been made as part of the process. So I'll hand it off to him now.
Colin Christopher, planner with the Planning Department. So I'm going to touch on two things. Number one, just go into some, why are we doing this? What's the reason for making this amendment? And then two, briefly walk through the changes, the proposed changes. By the way, I'm mostly just talking about the landscape screening portion of this amendment. So there are really four reasons why we're making this proposed change to the design standards for screening and landscaping. One is to incrementally improve the aesthetic and the quality of our built environment through increased landscape standards. We know that street trees frame views and enhance urban form of our streets. They make streets feel more inviting, comfortable, and safe. Drivers slow down and residents walk more on streets with trees on them. And then when we think about landscaping of parking lots and the impact that shade trees and understory have on parking lots, it has a major impact on the visual impact of those large surface lots. Reason number two, landscaping, in particular shade trees and street trees, offer a number of environmental impacts. They improve air quality, they reduce noise pollution, they reduce stormwater runoff and pollution, and they combat heat island effects created by street trees or created by parking lots and streets. Number three focuses on improving the consistency of the application of our design standards. We have a number of exemptions built into the standards that had the intent, I believe, of considering the challenges of developing in older districts. But as a consequence, they have resulted in inadequate landscaping that has a negative impact on the quality of these districts and surrounding neighborhoods. I'll give a few examples of that and how that applies. And then four, a desire to improve our design standards to better align with current development standards in the commercial development community. A lot of these things that we're proposing are things that already exist. The developers are doing on their own voluntarily. We see the value of them, and we'd like to incorporate them into the standards so that they apply across the board. So those are the four reasons. And with that, I'll just get into some of the highlights. Number one, I talked about the inconsistent application of the standards. Where this really applies is how it relates to parking lot screening. So I'll give you an example of a typical site. We have an exemption within our parking lot screening standards that says for shallow lots, and we define that as lots with an average lot depth of 150 feet or less, that an otherwise required screening in a front yard of a parking lot is no longer required. So in this example, this is north to south, less than 150 feet. Typically, if it was more than 150 feet, they would be required to screen their parking lot along the street. But because it has that shallower depth, they are not required to do so.
Excuse me, Mr. Collins, would you orient again the, where is the street in that?
So the street in this example would be here. So if you were to measure out these depths, this depth east to west is greater than 150 feet. So the standard doesn't, or the exemption doesn't apply there. If you measure this north to south measurement, that's less, I believe it's 135 feet. It's fronting a street, so this is their front yard. They have parking lot in that front yard, and so they would, without the exemption, be required to screen there. Because of that exemption, we don't require it. So that's one example. The other way to look at this is to zoom out a little bit and think about how that applies district-wide. So this is a 20-block stretch of O Street from 24th to 44th. I've put 30 dots on this map. And these dots represent properties that are under 150 feet in depth and have parking lot in the front yard. So they would qualify for that exemption. There are 2 green dots. Those are properties that are meeting the standard without the exemption. So they're providing screening even though they're not required to. There are 3 yellow dots that represent properties that have some level of screening. It doesn't meet the standard, but it's something. And then we have 25 dots that have absolutely no screening on them. They have no screening because they're not required to provide screening. So this is not an indication that they're not meeting the standard. This is what the standard results in as it's applied now. What we're proposing is to eliminate that exemption so that this doesn't occur. With that being said, we understand that not every property is going to be able to meet that standard. So I've got a couple other examples. This is the Godfather site at 33rd and O. This is a corner lot, so that means it has 2 potential street frontages where it might be required to provide screening but isn't because of that exemption. And you can see they have no landscaping there. Again, that meets the standard. But if we required them to provide landscaping, even on a very tight lot like this, they do in fact have the room. So I've highlighted in green the areas where they could provide enough screening to meet the proposed standard if it was applied.
Would they have to apply for an exemption, or because of the depth, of the current depth of the lot, they would not, say if they did a remodel, would they be required to go back and do those changes?
So if they weren't required to do it at the time, but if they came back and made improvements after the fact, the answer in this case is no, because the only time that the new standards would apply is if they were doing an addition to their current lot, and it would only apply to the part of the lot that is the addition. So in this case, there's really not room for any more parking. So there's not really a scenario where they'd have to go back after the fact and apply these standards. I also want to say the standards are not retroactive. So you're only required to provide the new standard when you do new development, and it's only applied to the new part of the development. So if you were to double the size of your parking lot, only the part that's being doubled has that application. The original 50% would follow the old standard.
If I may, while you have that up.
Yes, please.
Sure.
Continue.
So with your revised drawing under your proposed standards, are you saying the parking stalls would be the same either way?
Yes, they're not losing any parking here. This is room that they have under their current configuration to meet the proposed standard.
And what did you, to get that, the area had to come from someplace? Was it the depth of the parking stall, or was it the area to drive around?
So that red line represents approximately their property line.
Okay. They
have room between their property line and where they put their stalls to put the landscaping. So I haven't, and in this case, if you look over here, it's a little bit hard to see, but they just have pavement striping here. It's yellow pavement striping. That is space that, in theory, could have been used for a landscape bed.
Can you show us the previous drawing so we can see what it exists as now?
Yeah. So you can see right here, this striping right here, I'm proposing that would be bed. That's not being used as anything that I'm aware of. It's leftover space.
In between the Godfather's pole, the black pole with the sign on it, and the parking bumpers would be the other spot?
Yep, correct.
But with, as my colleague just noted, with those bumpers, how much of an overhang are you looking at with a vehicle beyond its front tire?
So the requirement for a screen is you have to have 6 feet of width. Of that 6 feet, 2 of that could be used for vehicle overhang. That gives you a minimum of 4 feet to plant your understory screening.
And so how far behind the lot line are you saying those bumpers are located?
And again, this is just an estimate, but if we call this the edge of the bumpers. From there to the property line is in that 5 to 6 foot range.
But you didn't measure it.
I didn't measure this site, no. I took this off of a GIS app, so I measured it digitally. So it should be fairly close.
I think it's important to note that this site is being used as an example. There are going to be a wide range of different situations, and we know that there are going to be some sites that have even more restrictions on it, but also there'll be sites that have easier possible ways of addressing these standards that currently would not be having to do that. This is a good example because of the fact that this redeveloped site became all pavement. And it's an example of what we could get some more landscaping done under these new proposed standards. So that's what we're, and I point that out mainly because this is not meant to be just about this site. This is a citywide application of the standards.
I believe it was all pavement before, though, when it was the gas station.
I believe it was. I guess
But it didn't become all pavement, it was all pavement.
Yes, and so the idea is that if we have new construction coming forward on some of these sites or older sites, we certainly could do better.
So with the new proposals, when it transitioned from a gas station to a pizza place, we would have encouraged screening in the green highlighted areas.
Correct.
And anything from the passage of this forward would be required.
Correct. I also point out, we have another property at this intersection, 33rd and O, the Starbucks site, which got built out with no landscaping. And the reality is if you go out there, there's not really room for landscaping. Well, we have a waiver process to address that. I don't think it's overly cumbersome. It's a administrative approval. If we denied it, then there is the chance to appeal to Planning Commission and then to Council. But we typically review those in 1 to 2 weeks. It's a $206 application fee. And that allows us to use common sense on sites where we think there's value in doing redevelopment without the burden of the parking lot screening. But when you look back at that map that had those 30 dots on it, our analysis is in most of those cases that they do have that 6 feet to provide that room for screening. And that we don't want to take that extreme worst case scenario and apply that across the board. And that is what our current standard does. It says in all cases where you have a shallow lot, you're not going to have to apply the standard where we are requiring that citywide everywhere else. And it has a real negative impact on the visual quality of those districts. Even though there's an intent, I think, there to make some accommodations. So there's a balance between making sure that we're applying these standards citywide, but also understanding that there are cases where we just can't do that and accommodating that with our waiver process.
Councilwoman Raybold?
So the zoning along O Street as the example that you gave, is that B2 and B3?
I believe it's B1, B3, yeah.
Okay.
Would you have approved Starbucks as it is now if it had come to you on an administrative waiver and this had been in effect?
I can take that one.
Okay.
I think that's a good question because that's a real life situation and it happened fairly recently. That is a situation where there would have been a discussion about trying to maximize the use of that property to the extent that it can be, and we would have had a conversation about trying to see where we could try to fit some of these landscaping and screening applications on that site. I think with the requirement, we would have the opportunity to have that conversation. It is very possible that through that process, we would have come up with exactly what we have out there today. It's possible, and I think that's what the flexibility of what Colin was saying about the waiver process is. It at least allows for that conversation to happen and to try to come to some middle ground, which is actually, quite frankly, what we've come up with through our process for this package, is that there has been some give and take on a couple of different points of view on this, and so that is another part of what I would like Colin to kind of walk through a little bit today before we're done.
I have a question.
Yes, Councilwoman
about
Raybold.
the process. So say, let's talk about Starbucks. Say if you said, no, you have to do that landscaping, it's a requirement, and can that business appeal the decision that you have made, and is the appeal process to us?
It starts with Planning Commission, then goes to you if they were to deny it.
Okay.
maybe just try to hit on some of the rest of the highlights and then some of the changes that have been made.
So item 2 of the amendment focuses on shade trees. This one's actually very minor. We have a requirement for parking lot shade trees that says 1 tree is required per 6,000 square feet of parking lot. We basically increased the standard by 1. So now every parking lot will be required to provide 1 additional tree. So if it is required to provide 4 now, it would provide 5 in the future. And that applies regardless of the size of the parking lot. The larger change here relates to the location of those shade trees within the parking lot. The current standard says that shade trees they're recommended within the standard to be located internally, meaning essentially within islands within the parking lot. However, when we look at our parking lot design standards, there's nothing that requires those islands. And so we've accommodated that by saying, if you want to locate them along the perimeter of the parking lot, you can do that at an increased rate, so at a 2-to-1 rate. What we're proposing is to find a place for those parking lot trees to occur internally with islands to require actual islands within the parking lot. So if I show you a typical example of a parking lot layout, and this is an example of what David mentioned where we were able to compromise along the way. The basic requirement here is at the end of every parking row, so that would be here, 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 and here, that we're requiring islands. And that we're also requiring for double row islands where you have double stacking of rows, that at each of those required islands, a shade tree would be required. We also have a requirement, in addition to those islands, with the intent of breaking up large parking lots, that says that no more than 40 stalls within a double row island can occur without locating an additional island. So if you look at this example, we've got the in islands at the end of the rows, but then we also have these 2 additional internal islands that break up those large swaths of parking. So this is kind of the maximum scenario here where each of these blocks is 40 stalls with islands at each end and then 2 in the middle.
Could you give us an idea of what would be the minimum width that you would suddenly require that intervening island? Or you showed a long area there, but I'm trying to understand.
So each stall,
you said 40 stalls, that's maybe 400 feet.
It's 20 stalls and 20 stalls. So it would be 9 feet times 20 stalls, 180 feet before you need another island.
And this would be on top of eliminating the 150-foot depth requirement. Is that correct?
Yes, although the reality is if we look at a typical shallow lot, they're not going to have this. It's going to look more like this. And so in this case, the islands that they would be required to provide would go in places like here, where there's not a parking stall, here, where there's not a stall, here, 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 and then these 2 which already have islands. So if the question is, would it have an overdue burden on a shallow lot like that, the reality is probably not, because they don't have the requirement that comes with the double row islands. When we did this initial proposal,
okay.
Let me just hit on one thing. When we did this initial proposal, we did initially say that those internal island breaks would also have to occur for the single rows as well. And in our conversations with developers, they told us that doing that would have an impact on their parking stall counts. And that as a way of kind of accommodating that concern, we eliminated that requirement. Those islands also had a shade tree requirement associated with them. That was removed as part of that compromise.
Okay, and you said the shade tree requirement came about if there was 6,000 square feet of area?
Yes, so, and that is the standard as it applies now, which is for every 6,000 square feet of parking lot area, you have to have 1 shade tree. Within that, whatever that total is, as part of this new proposal, a certain portion of those would have to be located within these double row islands. So in this example, let's say they were required to do 6 shade trees overall based on the size of their parking lot, and then of those 6, 3 of them are located in those islands. The other 3, they have the ability to move to other parts of the site if they desire. It's our preference that they locate them in these islands, but they have the potential to move those to other places along the perimeter.
Can we go to your godfather's example at 33rd and O and tell us what happened to the trees there on you suggested a way to have green space, and where would you put trees there? Because that's more than 6,000 square feet.
It is. It's probably not a whole lot more.
It's more than 6,000 square feet.
I would guess that would require 2 trees.
And where would you put those?
You could put it here. You could put it here. You could put it here.
You wouldn't want it on the corner, would you, to conflict with?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably some sightline issues there that you couldn't go right there. But I mean, any of this stretch would allow trees in it. This is probably 8 foot in depth. That's typically what we would allow for a street tree. So it's certainly allowable for a shade tree as well.
Again, the point of that particular site is to show that these can be applied. And it's not an unreasonable expectation for even a site like that.
I'm trying to look at the cumulative effect of these 4 items you're going through and take it on the same property and see exactly how much burden you're putting on that property, developer, or owner, or business.
I'm sorry, Councilman Christensen first, and Councilwoman Raybold.
I'm concerned about the additional cost this will impose upon commercial developments as well as multifamily residential developments. They're going to need more land to provide for all these requirements, which causes costs of development to go up, land costs to go up. And as we do that, that is a negative force on trying to provide affordable housing in our city. So that concerns me significantly that we're doing that. How does this apply to multifamily residential? Would you be applying the same standards for screening and such?
The screening standards would come into effect for anything that comes through a commercial building permit process, which does include multifamily, yes.
Okay. How about the fact, I've seen data recently that trees inside inside those islands tend to have significantly shorter lifespans than trees in larger areas, and there's a significant expense incurred by businesses by having to replace trees on 5 to 7 year basis. What's your response to that?
I think that when we think about trees in parking lot islands, there's certainly a balance of good and bad. And we believe that the good, the effects that it has on the environment, the effects it has visually on softening the built environment of our community, outweighs the negatives. It is true that a tree located in an island is going to have a shorter lifespan than one that's located in the middle of open space. I mean, that is a fact. Now, is that lifespan, I've heard somebody say 5 to 10 years. I think it's considerably higher than that. I think it's probably double that. But it does have a shorter lifespan. It also probably limits the overall size and maturity of that tree. But again, we have to balance the good and the bad.
I'm not worried about that part. I'm talking about the expense to the property owners to comply with this standard.
Yeah, I think some things that have been discussed through this process to date is about cost. And when it comes to street trees are a part of this package, as well as trees within parking lots. And an installed tree roughly costs about $200 installed. We believe that cost is, while it is a cost, first of all, those costs are being assumed and paid for in many of our developments already. So this is the application here, is to have that consistency factor and to have it, some of that to happen in some of the, especially in the older areas where they deserve to have some of this type of benefit of both trees as well as landscaping. So there's no doubt that there is the potential for some increased cost, but it's not the size of cost that would necessarily prohibit or preclude a development from happening. But we have had that discussion as part of this, and that was a good learning experience for us in talking with our development partners on this. And so, again, that gets into a lot of what Colin was saying there about location of trees, gets into looking at the site plan and putting them, and perhaps even the type of species in certain locations that can have the most success. And so there's kind of a more holistic way of looking at this that we're trying to address.
I understand your desire to have consistency. I mean, I've personally viewed it as just a cookie cutter, that everybody has to be the same. But you've already said a couple times that, both of you have said this at least once, that many developers are voluntarily doing these new ways of developments. So it begs the question, why not let market forces decide winners and losers? If the public is demanding this kind of thing, then the people who provide it will win. And we won't have to worry about forcing people to incur additional costs. And again, I come back to the affordable housing issue. Anything you do in this city to make building and development more expensive makes housing more expensive. And the people that pay are not the developers. The people that pay are the users of the property, the people who rent apartments. And this concerns me significantly. We're pushing this stuff in the wrong direction, in my opinion. Convince me otherwise.
Let me do a couple things. Number one, when it comes to multifamily, the shallow lot exemption, my guess is, will almost never apply because those are typically not shallow lots. So again, we're reverting back to the old standard, and we're not changing anything as it relates to multifamily. The other thing I just want to mention that I didn't mention initially was, with our discussion with the development community, we did acknowledge that, you know what, sometimes there's a better use for those islands, and that if a developer absolutely is opposed to putting shade trees in there because, for instance, they're worried about the concern of tearing up an island and pavement after the fact because the trees died and they have to replace it. If there is that concern, they have a couple allowances that we built in cases where they're going to use those islands for other good uses. One of them would be plant those islands with native landscapes that have water efficiency. That's a concern that we heard, that trees require more watering and it increases their water bills. So we said, if you're going to plant those instead of shade trees, if you're going to put native grasses and other water efficient plants in there, that will allow you to move the otherwise shade tree requirement to other parts of the site. The other thing we acknowledge is that sometimes those islands get used for stormwater management. And in those cases, those aren't the best places for trees a lot of times. And so if somebody's using that to do a rain garden, for instance, that would be an application where we'd allow that tree to be moved elsewhere to another part of the site.
Under what conditions would you allow those? Do they have to make a permit application? And you still haven't answered my question about, you know, impacting the cost of the land itself. The use of the land itself that you're proposing increase costs, and anytime you increase land costs, you increase housing costs. So I'm talking about affordable housing. Relate this to how this is not going to be a negative impact on affordable housing, please.
Okay, so to directly answer that question, Colin had mentioned, and I'll reiterate, that affordable housing today and moving forward is going to need to take the form of multifamily housing. That's really the reality of the situation. Multifamily housing often is dealing with larger sites, certainly not tiny sites. There are some older areas that have apartments, existing apartments, but at the same time, those larger sites are going to basically apply what the existing standard is today. So it's not really imposing a new standard, a new requirement on those sites. So that's a specific answer to that question. I would also point out that these types of standards, when we did a comparison to other communities, we're still not at a point where other communities are requiring certain things like this. And I mention that because our competitive edge as a community, when we're competing with other cities, part of that competitive edge is to present a community with the visual look to it and the amenities for people that want to live here or choose to live here or move here This is the type of amenity as well as type of livable nature of our community that we want to try to get more of. A big message coming out of our downtown master plan was mentioning green space and trying to soften the streetscape and the livability of our downtown. This is a subset of that conversation. This spreads it out to other areas of trying to get more of that green and type of livable nature of our neighborhoods, especially in older areas that haven't had the benefit of a lot of investment, such as the Edge development has had, that has a lot of this already, that already is abiding by a lot of these things already. And I will also point out that as we've looked at this, there is kind of a breakdown, and Councilman Christensen, you mentioned that there are developers locally that are doing a lot of this or more, even at a higher level, and I agree with that. Unfortunately, that is only about 25% of the activity that's going out there. There's a breakdown of what happens here is we have that upper tier of people that already acknowledge that this type of investment in a development is worth it because they're more marketable and they have more success in that sense. There's about a middle range, roughly about a middle 50% that will do whatever the requirements say to do, and they kind of get to that minimum and they'll do that. And then there, unfortunately, is kind of the lower tier of development activity that really is trying not to even do that minimum, and we need to raise up that bottom level to get to a certain minimum. And that is a lot of what this is about. And so that it gets back to that consistency factor that I think most of us can agree to, and trying to get to a certain level so that we have a community that looks and feels and addresses some of these needs and desires of our residents and potentially future residents, trying to either retain them or to get them to attract them to come here. And this is part of that strategy.
My point was that this plan as proposed will create an overall upward pressure on land costs. And that will put the wrong kind of pressure on affordable housing. I need to hear from you how this is going to affect affordable housing efforts in our city.
I'm going to push my microphone thing and say, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm going to try to move this on a little bit more. Everybody keep in mind his question. I think Councilman Raybold and then Councilman Camp had something to say. And Mr. Christopher, you still have a presentation to do, correct?
I have a few more items to cover.
Okay. Yeah.
Just real quickly, I want to address some of the things that Councilman Christensen mentioned. As a developer with large parking lots, you know, we struggle with the balance, and we also struggle with the practicality. There's just a couple of thoughts that I do have and can share with you that, yes, it's really hard to keep established trees growing in islands, primarily because of all the de-icers that we use and the salt treatments that we have to use on our parking lots to make sure that our customers are safe and happy and they don't have any falls or tumbles. But, you know, it's really hard for trees to do that. We have gone to a lot of different type of grasses that seem to be very effective and offer that type of green cover that is truly very attractive and lovely. But when it comes to some of the drive areas that you were pointing out, we never put a tree in a drive area just because of the obstruction to the drivers as they're coming in and out of a parking lot. It creates problems for them to make sure that they can see that oncoming traffic that wants to enter in that drive. So I'm concerned about, is there some practicality put in where the burden is not necessarily on that business owner, that they always have to argue, like, well, we can't put trees over in this area. It creates shadows that at nighttime make the parking lot look very dark and uninviting, and people don't feel safe in things that have too many shadows from trees or shrubs and things like that. And, you know, we recognize that greening our community is always a good thing, but there has to be that balance, and I feel like maybe the burden is on the business owner to state the reasons why they shouldn't be putting a tree over here and having to argue about putting it in another location in an effort to try to achieve probably the same goal. And I don't know is there a balance, because it seems like the burden is going to be on the business owner to state the reasons why a tree shouldn't be there. And is there, you know, a process that it's more agreeable rather than going through more strict requirements?
Even though we are increasing the standard, I think what hasn't changed is that the standard is very flexible. And aside from the waiver process, which is kind of the last resort, we have worked in enough allowances, I think, to accommodate putting trees where it makes sense. So like I mentioned, if you wanted to plant those with native grasses, that gives you essentially the freedom to plant those trees anywhere around the parking lot that you want. Even if you planted the trees in the islands, you're only required to do a small percentage of those. If you look like at a big, large lot site that's been redeveloped in recent years, say the Costco site, they have 2 trees per island in almost every island. That is probably triple what this requirement is. That even when we're requiring the trees in islands, it's only 1 tree per island. There's a way to move those out of the islands if you do something else. And so I think there's enough flexibility within the standard that you can meet the standard in a variety of ways if you decided it doesn't make sense for me to put a shade tree here because I think it's going to tear up my lot, or I think it's going to block views onto my site, or onto the signage in my site. So my answer would be, I think we've considered that stuff and we've made it flexible enough to allow some of that accommodation.
And I would reiterate that strongly, that we started with that point of view, and it's even become more flexible in some of the changes that have been made in the proposal to this point now. So that the flexibility there's an emphasis on the flexibility of how to attain meeting the standards while having some different options of where you can place some of these plantings.
Councilman Camp has some questions.
Well, and I appreciate what my colleague Ms. Raybold said, because she's often in a bigger area, and a lot of this standard is going to smaller areas, but it applies to the larger areas. And Mr. Christensen talked about the cost of land. There's a cost up front. In many cases, especially on the smaller lots, you're going to be eliminating parking, but you've also got maintenance. I think you were all around this weekend. We had a substantial snowfall. You start throwing islands and all these things there, it makes snow removal difficult and more expensive, and we're piling it somewhere. And so there are ongoing costs there for that, and again, especially in the smaller lots, I don't think you fully appreciate, not being in business yourselves, of what is being faced by both the developers and the business owners. Another element, Mr. Christensen was asking about affordable housing. I would suggest that with these standards, you're now starting to tip the pendulum far enough that you'll have no development. And if you look at 33rd and O, if Starbucks hadn't come in or Godfather's hadn't come in, those are eyesores. And those are vast improvements at that intersection. I mean, Starbucks, they leveled a hill there. I mean, if you remember back when that was there. And so I think what you're doing is also creating the opportunity for no development, and so areas just underutilized, ignored, vacant, which is contrary. Activity breeds activity. And then another point you're starting to talk about, Mr. Christopher, about the green space, and we want that, and we all do. We want a livable community, and I agree with Mr. Carey on that. But look at what we spent in the tens of millions of dollars in Antelope Valley, putting lots of green space, and you mentioned all your land area went from 24th to 44th Street. Well, Antelope Valley is a significant portion there that we've now created areas of excellence, and so there needs to be some credit given in a way there that the green space may not be on every individual lot, but you have created that, and our whole city is founded on a park system that has done a lot of that, and as a result, I think you're, again, barking up a tree that's making it more expensive. It's going to thwart development, especially on these smaller lots, and even on the bigger ones, that the improbability that certain trees and vegetation can be there, the safety elements. So I ask you to consider that.
I think their point is that there aren't enough trees to bark up. I think they're trying to say there aren't enough trees to bark up, John.
Mr. Christopher, would you continue with your presentation?
I will continue. Let me touch on one other thing. Just another point of trying to be as flexible as possible. If we go back to that Godfather site, and this is something that we actually have in our standard for downtown, but now we're including it in citywide design standards, which is to say, in a case like this where we're requiring that screening now along the front that otherwise wouldn't have been. We're also allowing alternative treatments, and the most common treatment would be a freestanding masonry wall in that location, as opposed to a screen that requires regular maintenance. It's going to increase cost initially compared to the maybe putting in shrubs, but maintenance-wise, long-term, it is probably a cheaper solution, and it still achieves the goal of softening the visual impact of that parking lot. The other major topic I want to address before I kind of close out here is street trees. Currently, street trees are only required as a component of subdivision of land or as a component of a use permit, a special permit, or a PUD if that is negotiated into that agreement. What the new amendment, the proposed amendment, proposes essentially is that street trees would now be required as part of the commercial building permitting process for new construction. So that doesn't mean remodels, it doesn't mean tenant finishes, building additions, site additions. It only addresses new construction, in which case the developer would require to provide street trees as required by the street tree design standards. Those are based on, the spacing of those trees are based on the speed limit of the road, so I can't give you an exact requirement because it kind of depends on the location, but typically that's going to be limited, except for the large sites, to 1 to 2 trees per site, just because we space them out, street trees essentially at 1 per, let's say, 70 feet, linear feet of street frontage. And so for your average lot, especially your smaller lots, we're typically only thinking about 1 tree. I'll also say during our conversations with developers on the street tree issue, there was a lot of concern about how this impacts street trees in older districts, let's say like O Street, where there's a natural built environment, and in some cases, and maybe in most cases, along stretches of O Street, there's simply not room for a street tree. And so as part of those discussions, we worked into the language that there would be a determination during the review process, wouldn't require any additional waivers, that if the reviewer determined based on the standards within the street tree design standards that there was no room for a street tree, then that requirement would be waived. So during that review process, the Parks and Rec representative looks at the plan and says, there's no room to put a tree here, no trees are going to be required.
Sorry, Gil.
Just a question. So, you know, along O Street, there's just so much concrete,
Yes.
and sidewalks are right up to the curb. Would that property owner be expected to rip up that?
That's a good example, because in that stretch, that concrete is in the right-of-way. There is no expectation that they have to go in and pull up concrete.
Okay.
If their room allows, based on the conditions of the built environment, then it would be required. If there's concrete, like there is in a lot of those properties, that determination would be made that there wouldn't be a requirement of a street tree there.
Okay.
And then the last and final component of this is just what I would...
Excuse me, so on the Godfather's example, since there was concrete there, you wouldn't apply it?
No.
But you showed it as an example.
If as part of their overall redevelopment of a project, if all of a sudden space allowed, then yes. But in this case, that red line is the property line. Everything outside of that property line,
So they wouldn't
still
have
concrete.
to do all this?
So they still don't have room for it in that case.
So what you show there, they wouldn't have to do under this proposed standard?
They wouldn't have to do the proposed street tree standard.
Street trees.
Oh, but they still have to do the green space?
They have to do screening of their lot, of their parking lot. And they would have to do the shade tree requirement.
If they did a major redevelopment, that's a question more of a statement. If they ripped up all the concrete and said we're going to put it all back as concrete, you'd say no, we need to talk about some green space.
If they're starting over, essentially, then yes.
Well, I think the language I read correct me if I'm wrong, said if you spend more than 50% of what you paid for the property.
Good. I'm glad you brought that up. Colin's going to explain that part of it too now.
So that was part of our original proposal, was to say that, and this only, by the way, applies to street trees. That's the only part of this standard that particular threshold applies to. We were saying initially when we went to Planning Commission that street trees would be required for new construction and for properties that are doing major improvements where the total construction cost exceeds 50% of the assessed value of the property. We had also worked in, as part of our negotiations, that wouldn't include interior remodels. It would only apply to major site work happening either on the exterior of the building or beyond the exterior in the site. In the process of going through Planning Commission, they made a motion to eliminate that from the standard, and so what you had before you does not include that second component. So street trees now only apply to the first part of that, which was for new construction.
So the 50% concept is not part of the package now.
So what constitutes major renovation?
We don't have to worry about that at this point because it's been removed from the package.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Grister, you had one more thing to make, I think.
Just very quick, this package also includes general cleanup, reformatting of the document, consolidation of the design standards where we've taken requirements from other chapters and included them in this chapter so that all parking lot or all screening and landscape related changes or standards are in one place. And then we've also updated the enforcement procedure to better reflect the procedures that are actually in place today. So that is the highlights, and if you have any additional questions.
Thank you. Councilwoman Gaylor Baird has some questions. Thank you.
I thought it would be valuable for you to put up on the screen the memo that you sent to us following Planning Commission, because at Planning Commission there were a lot of concerns raised, a lot of testimony, a lot of discussion with planning commissioners themselves. I think it's on page 26. And it's the, they made it clear that they wanted you all to take another look and sit with stakeholders after their meeting to make revisions to this package. Can you put up the list of changes so that we're clear, aside from the one that they made in the voting session, the other, I'm not sure I've ever seen this many, revisions done in a proposal between planning and council, and I think you are to be commended for taking the time to do that. And it was important to do this. Can you just
you want me to go through each one of these?
Well, quickly.
Okay. Number one relates to that enforcement procedure. We have a standard now that says that you're actually allowed 12 months from the time of certificate of building occupancy to install your landscape. We believe that was excessive, that you should be allowed 6 months. And the reason why that exists, by the way, is that if you completed your project in November, you're not going to have landscape installed in November. So we were giving 6 months, which would get us to May. What we heard in our discussions was that that's a very busy time of year for landscape contractors. So as a result, we increased that standard to 8 months now, which is less than what the original was, but more than what we had originally proposed. Item 2 I touched on earlier, but this is an added exception to allow the required width of buffer space for a parking lot screen to exist to go down from 6 feet to 3 feet in cases where they're providing an alternative treatment like either a retaining wall or a freestanding masonry wall. Item 3, again, we talked about this one, where our initial proposal was to have these additional islands, both for double rows and single rows, to break up long stretches of parking, and that would require trees within those. And we compromised to eliminate the single row islands and just the additional double row islands as part of this. Item 4, we had, in addition to the island requirement, we had also built in some language that said you needed to have a certain percentage of your parking lot island have what we called internal landscaping. And we eliminated that for smaller to medium-sized lots. It's now only applying to larger lots, which is those that are over 200 stalls. So that wouldn't have really any impact now on the smaller lots. Item 5. This also relates to the double row islands and the single row islands. Originally, we had said that both single row and double row islands would require shade trees. We're now saying only the double row islands require shade trees. And then 6, 7, and 8 all relate to what can be planted in those islands. So I talked about this, but we're allowing some exceptions within the islands if you're doing native grasses, if you're doing stormwater management treatments. We also wrote in a exception to say if you're using that island for, let's say, a utility like a light pole, that we would make some allowances on the types of trees that could be located within that island so that the two could coexist. So instead of a full shade tree, you might allow either an evergreen tree or an ornamental tree that doesn't take up as much space and doesn't interfere with the light pole itself. And then number 9 is what we talked about with the clarifying language on street trees to say where room doesn't exist because there's concrete in the right-of-way, that we will explicitly waive that requirement during our review process.
And I think you would add one more change, which we had just talked about as well, which is that 50% rule that has been removed from the package. So that was taken action at the Planning Commission hearing, so it wasn't part of this memo, but it is part of the package now that's before you. And that memo is dated December 10th, just so you know.
Thank you. Other questions from the council? Gentlemen, that took a little bit of time, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Is there anyone else in the chamber that would like to speak on this agenda item? Okay.
Wait.
What? Up there.
Entertaining testimony in opposition now?
Yes. Pretty much any and all testimony.
Good afternoon. My name is Ann Post. I'm an attorney with Baylor Evans Law Firm. I'm here today testifying in opposition of this text amendment on behalf of my client Speedway Properties. And our concern is that this text amendment as written will have a substantial negative impact on the ability to redevelopment properties in older areas of Lincoln. And to address this concern, we are proposing 2 amendments to the current text amendment, which we think strikes a balance to both meet some of the goals proposed by the Planning Department, but also recognize the practical realities of redeveloping in the urban built environment. So the first issue that has been discussed thoroughly is the screening for shallow lots. The current design standards, as explained, do not require screening on these lots. This change would require screening on these lots. Currently, screening isn't required from the practical realization that these are small lots. When redeveloping on small lots in older areas, every square foot is critical. These lots are typically 142 feet deep. They're located in Lincoln's older areas, and they don't have the square footage to meet today's expectations for landscaping. If we're going to apply landscaping requirements and screening requirements for drafted to meet today's expectations, it's going to significantly deter development in these older areas. Our next issue is abutting parking lots, screening between abutting parking lots. Currently, there's no requirement for screening between 2 parking lots right next to each other. I think the idea behind that is that the aesthetics of one parking lot aren't really ruined by having to look at another parking lot. And our concern is that if you require screening, a 6-foot wide screen that's 6 feet of space along the entire boundary of the property that you can no longer use for that development, whether you need it for parking or for circulation or for the footprint of the building itself, you can no longer use that. That reduces the amount of space you have on that old shallow lot and significantly reduces your ability to redevelop that property. We want to acknowledge that yes, this package was brought before you as this amendment was brought before you as a package. There are incentives, there are also these requirements. Some of these incentives include things like a reduction in the minimum required parking for certain uses, increased flexibility with joint parking or off-site parking. But the problem is that in most cases, it's the use of the property that drives the number of required stalls as opposed to the zoning code. For example, if you use your property as a carry-out pizza restaurant, it's going to require less parking stalls than a coffee shop, and no matter what the zoning code says. Under the zoning code, those two uses might require the same amount of parking, but just practically you're not going to have a successful business if you provide the same amount of parking for those two uses. And so while these proposed incentives might be beneficial in certain circumstances, if you have a commercial center with different uses and different peak hours, these incentives can be very beneficial. But when you look at your older shallow lots that don't have the ability to have different uses with cross parking in many, if not in most situations, these incentives don't provide the practical benefit that they might provide in other areas, yet these properties are still saddled with the burden of many of these restrictions. So therefore today I'm asking for your support for 2 amendments to the proposal, the text amendment before you. One of those is to retain the screening exemption for shallow lots, that's lots less than 150 feet deep. And the second is to retain the exemption from screening requirements between abutting parking lots. We feel that these 2 amendments help to strike the balance. We recognize that there is benefit to a community to have the aesthetics of more greenery. At the same time, you're redeveloping in an urban environment. And the more square footage that you can't use for your redevelopment is going to limit your ability to redevelop, and it's going to result in having some of those older properties that don't redevelop nearly as quickly to bring that benefit to the community. So with that, I would take any questions.
Any questions from the council for this testifier? Councilman Camp.
Yes, Ms. Post, I think you were in the audience when several of us asked some questions, and thinking about these shallower and smaller lots, there were a number of different requirements on trees, setbacks, and that sort of thing. Can you explain how your 2 proposals on amendments would solve those, or does it still leave some of those concerns in the legislation?
Our 2 proposals solve our most pressing concerns. Will there be issues on a shallow lot with putting street trees around the perimeter of the parking lot? Potentially, yes, there will be. And so as much as we would like to keep the code where it is today, I think these are the 2 asks that are the most impactful to be able to allow us to continue redevelopment in Lincoln's older areas.
Okay. Councilman Camp, do you have additional questions?
Not at the moment, thank you.
Okay. Other questions from the council? Ms. Post, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dustin Antonello, Antonello. My address is 620 North 48th Street, Suite 205. And I'm appearing on behalf of the Lincoln Independent Business Association. The Lincoln Independent Association would like to thank the Planning Department for listening to the feedback from the development community and modifying the proposed changes to the screening and landscaping requirements for parking lots. The changes that the Planning Department made during the Planning Commission process represent a substantial improvement over the initial proposal. LIBA members do, however, have some lingering concerns over the standards, especially as they relate to redevelopment in older neighborhoods. We believe some of the requirements in the text amendment will make it extremely difficult to redevelop smaller lots in older areas of town where redevelopment is badly needed but space is limited. These areas simply cannot be redeveloped without receiving a variance from the planning department. We believe the necessity of a variance will prohibit certain redevelopment projects from ever being brought forth for consideration, and as such will lead to unintended consequences for Lincoln's older neighborhoods. LIBA believes the following changes to the text amendment will create the flexibility for redevelopment to occur on smaller lots. Maintain the screening exception for shallow lots with an average lot depth of less than 150 feet, and maintain the exception that exempts abutting parking lots from being screened from one another. Again, LIBA appreciates the Planning Department's willingness to listen to our feedback and make substantial changes to the initial proposal. With that, you have any questions? I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions from the council? Seeing none, Mr. Antonello, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, Mark Hunziker. I'm also appearing on behalf of B&J Partnership or Speedway Motors. Quickly, two short points. I hadn't actually intended to say anything today, but first of all, keep in mind that the cost impact of these changes disproportionately affect properties which are in the older parts of town and which are limited in the size of the parcels that you're dealing with. And secondly, the use of a waiver process to eliminate all concerns over this change is a little overstated. Waivers can be granted and are occasionally, but already we're talking about a $200 fee and a 2-week review process and waivers of street trees being referred out to the Parks Department. 2 weeks is minimum. It takes time, it takes money, and it takes a lot of thought to go through this process. And remember that the flexibility and common sense that are so easily summoned in a forum like this somehow escape when actual applications are in front of people. You saw just today where the planning department stood up here and recommended denial of an address change in a situation they admitted was, tailor-made for approval of an address change. But the reason for the denial is the next one might be hard. And we don't want to set any precedents that might make it hard for us the next time. It's not that easy to get waivers. It doesn't come automatically. And in cases, even as you saw today, where it's patently obvious to everybody that it ought to be approved, you get a recommendation of denial just because the next one might be harder. I'll try to answer any questions you might have. Councilman?
Yeah. Yes, Mr. Hunziker, thank you. You talked about the cost of waivers. You mentioned the $200 and some filing fee, the potential 2-week delay, if you had to refer to Parks and Rec on trees or something. What about other costs to the developer? And I guess I'm thinking in terms of engineering fees, their design fees, architectural fees, your fees, not to...
Mine are cheap.
Well,
yeah, I mean, when you start the process of redeveloping, particularly an older site, you do incur those fees, and you do have to go through the process of somebody actually designing the parking lot to find out how much of this stuff is going to apply, how much of it you might need to get waived, and to spend time with people going down to the planning department or wherever to discuss the possibility of these waivers and what the appetite is for agreeing to those waivers. It's costly, And the real cost of regulation like this is not, it's partly in that people have to pay for all that stuff in order to get waivers, in order to get projects finished. But the other cost that you never see is the number of projects that just never see the light of day because these kinds of things come up and the project may or may not, may be marginal enough that even going through the process isn't worth it, because if you get denied, you're not going to be able to do a project, or if you don't get everything you want, you might not have a project. Those are the kinds of things that you just never see because they never see the light of day. People are unwilling to spend the time, effort, and money to actually run through the process when it's uncertain whether they're going to make it on a project that may or may not be able to survive if they don't get all the waivers they need.
Councilwoman Land would like to ask some questions.
Thank you. So thinking of the underlying amendment altogether, isn't there going to be a greater expense to developers even to begin with? I mean, it's got to be easier to lay a parking lot without having trees every so often. So isn't that going to make that development more expensive?
There'll be some additional cost to that. I mean, the actual layout of the parking lot, as was pointed out, if you're out in an area where you have plenty of land to work with, most designers are doing a lot of what this requirement will entail anyway.
Voluntarily.
Yes. I mean, you go out to Williamsburg, you'll see almost everything out there is in very close compliance with these regulations. Now, they may have a parking lot or two that are not screened from one another, or a few things like that, but most of the time, in areas where they have enough room to do it, that the architects are designing those features in. It's when you get into the older parts of the community, the 33rd and O type situations, where you have limited amount of space for parking, and you have a user like Starbucks that needs every parking space they can possibly get, where you run into these kinds of problems.
I have some concerns also for new developers breaking into the industry. I mean, we have some developers that are quite well heeled and they can develop these properties very easily. So I'm concerned about those, and I'm wondering, will this increase, does it have a potential to increase requests for TIF even just to get this done for smaller developers, for instance?
I hadn't really thought about increased requests for TIF, although I would think that in most cases where we've used TIF, we have not used TIF to meet minimum requirements for things like landscaping or parking or facade treatment, for example. The TIF has typically been used for things which exceed those requirements. But anything that increases the cost in a redevelopment project is going to make the economics of it more difficult. It's just the nature of the project, the nature of the type of project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Other questions from the council? Mr. Hunziker, thank you. Gentleman from planning, would you like a rebuttal? Please, come forward.
We'll keep this brief. It's getting late in the evening now. A couple points, and Colin will have some ideas as well. I'd like to speak to the idea of striking a balance, and that is what I firmly believe we have in this package as proposed. We started with a concept of trying to come up with a package that made sense. We had a public process get us to a point where we have dealt with a lot of the issues that were brought up by our development community. We just went through item by item that. We also had one of those items acted on by the Planning Commission when they took their action in their suggestion for approval of this by removing the 50% for some developments. I believe that the striking of balance has happened as far as this proposal is concerned. And within that is this idea that our older areas of our city, while they do have additional challenges because of whether it's restricted lot size or cost of assembly of land, it does not mean that those sites should not have some of these screening and landscaping features and trees on their sites. I believe that we, through our process, and then this evening, we've pointed out that in many cases, these requirements can still be met on those restricted sites. I believe that the balance here is that we should provide for our community, our entire community, some of these aspects of our developments. And the perception of our community should be such that we have just as good looking developments in our older areas as we do on the edges. That is one point I wanted to make. I also wanted to just point out that the planning department has, over the last several years, both under my guidance as well as previous directors, namely Marvin Kraut, we have put forth the effort to become much more customer friendly, and that is a commitment that we continue to have. And I want to state that on the record tonight, that these types of proposed standards, along with the waiver process and those discussions that would go into that, we have sincerity behind our words here, that we will work with developers and property owners as they come forward to try to make common sense decisions. That is not just words. You have been here long enough to know that that has been our effort over the years now, and it will continue to be that way. I will hand it off to Colin. He would like to mention something about the idea of the abutting parking lots and screening in between those.
Yeah, first I want to maybe address the shallow lots exemption too, since those were the two items brought up both by Ann and Dustin. I think it's always valuable to look at real world examples if we can, and to show how these can be applied. So this is 48th and Huntington. On one side of the street here you have an existing development that is probably going to be developed at some point or redeveloped at some point, but is in pretty poor state. On the other side of the street you have a fairly new recent redevelopment project. If we look at what those look like in perspective, this is the older site. It doesn't have any landscape screening on it. Again, it's not required. Here's another view of that property. This falls within that 150-foot shallow lot exemption. On the other side of the street, this is what it looks like after redevelopment. This was not required. This was voluntary, but it's probably the exception and not the rule in terms of what gets done voluntarily when it comes to parking lot screening. And so you can see on the other side of that sidewalk, they have provided on a pretty shallow lot, even though it probably doesn't quite meet that 6 feet, they found a way to get some landscape screening in there and provide great benefit to that property in a creative way that works and makes that neighborhood better. That's the goal, is when we can fit this stuff in, this is going to have a dramatic improvement on these neighborhoods as it gets applied over and over. So that's the real intent of the standard. Go back to abutting parking lots. That's not something that I addressed in my initial discussion. I maybe should give you a little bit of background here. The current standard says that when you have one parking lot next to another, that the screening that would otherwise be required is not. We have clarified that language to say that that exemption would only apply when there's connectivity between those two parking lots. So in this diagram, you can see a very basic typical example of that, where they, in this case, have both a drive aisle and an access drive that connects those two lots. The requirement is only that they have one of those, that they have one drive aisle or one access drive, in which case they would not be required to provide screening. But in cases where the lots are completely separate lots that are simply adjacent to one another, that they would be required to provide that screening. Going back to 33rd and O in that area, I think this is a good example of built environment along an older district. And you can see within this example, a number of these lots are in fact connected, and so in those cases, they would not be required to provide that screen. If, however, you look at these two lots right here, the car wash and the Jiffy Lube, they are completely separate from one another. If you look at it in 3D, you can see there are bollards that have been put up to separate that lot. We believe, and we have proposed, that in those cases, that there be a buffer there between those two parking lots. One, because when we think of a parking lot next to a parking lot, you often think laterally, site to site, but what you're not considering is that along the street, nobody cares that those aren't the same parking lots. If we're requiring screening of parking lots in other scenarios, why wouldn't we require them in this scenario? The second part of that is there's no guarantee if you're redeveloping this property and are required to put screening in here that this property over here will always be a parking lot or a car wash, that potentially in a very short period of time that lot could get redeveloped, in which case you now have missed your opportunity to provide screening between those two sites. That said, I think this is an item that we would potentially be willing to compromise on, and if you directed us to do so, I think we would continue to negotiate with the development community and come up with a fair compromise to that exemption that will hopefully address some of their concerns.
Yeah, on the requirement for screening between abutting parking lots, that's what, 6 feet is what's being proposed?
Yes.
So is that 6 feet on both lots?
Yes.
So 12 feet would be taken out of the two lots?
Correct. Now, that wouldn't happen at the same time, but if they both eventually got redeveloped, in that case, you'd have 6 feet and 6 feet, yes.
Other questions for the rebuttal?
I do have
Sorry,
one
yeah.
other. On the waiver idea, would this be required to come into play to negotiate for a waiver after a building permit was filed, so there'd be drawings and everything of the parcel and property?
I always recommend, if there are questions about wanting a waiver, that the developer, the design consultant, reach out to us as soon as possible to avoid delays in the process. And so if they gave us a preliminary request without making it official and paying the fee, we could give them a preliminary decision on whether we think we would approve it or not. If they submit their commercial building permit and then find out, oh yeah, we're not meeting this standard, we have to go get a waiver, that slows the process down. So the waiver could exist anywhere along that timeline. Hopefully it's happening sooner than later so that we can address it in a timely manner.
And I do believe that this is more generally applicable, not just for this proposal tonight, but part of the intent for standards are to be as clear as possible, and the understanding is there so that as those applications come in, there is already an understanding of what the requirement is, that it would include all those requirements as long as they are well spelled out in the standards. And then, as Colin said, if there is a constraint on the site, that hopefully that applicant would start with that discussion instead of go down the line much further and try to change that along the way, instead of having that conversation up front.
Even if you did that before you filed something, that still takes a lot of review, and it's going to involve professionals and costs and designs, is it not?
Well, from our end, the waiver is all internal. It's me, and David's ultimately the one signing off on that. We have it written into the procedures that it takes up to 2 weeks. I think that's conservative. I think often it would take much less time than that. I can't speak to how much it takes for the other side to create that application and submit it, but it's not a especially lengthy application. It's essentially a one-page application plus a letter describing why they want relief from that particular requirement, and then submittal of the fee.
Other comments from the council? Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me.
I know it's been a while since we looked at our agenda. I'm a little confused. Are we on D next, or did we just do D? Did C and D together.
We did
That's
C and D
correct.
together, yeah.
I like the way that sounds.
There's no one else that wishes to come forward. That concludes our public hearing. We can move into the voting session. with item 7A, amending the pay schedule for the employee group whose classifications are assigned to the pay range prefixed by the letter M by creating the classification of Superintendent of Stormwater, introduced by Gaylor Baird.
So moved.
Second.
You have a motion by Councilman Gaylor Baird, second by Councilman Christensen. I think they had a superhero conversation the last time we were here.
Yep.
Is there any discussion of the motion? I think we're ready for a roll call.
Camp?
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb?
Yes.
Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried, 7-0. Our resolutions on first reading are items 8A through E. Our ordinances on first reading are items 9A through E. Our pending list are items 11A through C. Anyone wishing to address the council on a matter not on this agenda and not planned to appear on a future agenda may do so at this time, since it is open microphone.
Yes, please come forward if you wish to make a public comment. You'll have 5 minutes to speak. At 1 minute left, we'll give you a 1 minute warning.
Good evening. I was going to say good afternoon, but we've kind of...
Yeah, we kind of passed that by.
I got this new watch at Christmas, this iWatch, and I was sitting back there fumbling around with it, trying to turn it off, so be quiet. But it kept beeping at me and telling me to stand up. So you guys have all been sitting here. I don't know how you do it, you know.
250 steps every hour.
Yeah, see? There was a couple things I wanted to talk about. First one being the property tax.
I'm sorry.
My name is George Peters.
Thank you, George Peters.
And it's 4921 Chelsea Court. And
Thank
I've
you.
only done this one time before, so.
You're doing better than me so far.
No. I had about a $550 increase in my property taxes. And I got greetings from the county on Saturday, even though we had the snow, that my assessment was going up about $16,000. And I came down here a couple of years ago when you were all talking about the quarter of a penny for the communication system, and I thought it was really the right thing to do, and I've heard it was successful and did what it was supposed to do, and I'm glad that the property taxpayers aren't going to pay for that system for 20 years when it's already all over with and done with, and everybody that comes to Lincoln paid for that, and I think that was totally the right way to go. And I don't think it hurt anybody, and nobody missed anything before it. But I have this increase, and now I'm probably going to have another big increase, and this is just found money for all of you because you don't even have to raise the millage to do it. I think it's wrong. I found out when I did that only 42% of the city pays property taxes, and that's wrong. That means that the large majority of this town is tax-free. And I think that you should change that because the rest of the country that have cities that are comparable to Lincoln are riding along at about 65 to 70%. You could take in the same amount of money at that place, lower the millage, and you'd all be heroes with the property tax payers here. To the point, this is an election year, and there's going to be a new mayor, and some of you are going to be different, and it could be a campaign issue, and I think it should be, and I think it should be brought out and should be done. You make the rules, and you can fix this. And I'm a baby boomer. I've got quite a few friends and know quite a few people now that are saying that because of the property taxes, Lincoln is almost getting too expensive to stay here. These are people that are born and raised and lived here their whole life, and now they're saying that, you guys want too much money. And I think that, it should be fixed and corrected, and it can be fixed. And it would take Lincoln way into the future, There's 7 of you here, and Republicans and Democrats. I've never seen a bunch of Republicans and Democrats vote 7 times and all agree on so many things as you have tonight. I mean, you should go tell those people in Washington how to do this. Because you're doing a good job. You really are. But I think that's something that needs to be fixed. The other thing that I think needs to be fixed is, and this was on the news the other night, and this was true a couple of years ago, Lincoln has 1.2 cops per 1,000 people. And at the time a couple of years ago, when I did some checking, it was 1.8 nationally. Now they say on the TV the other night it's 2.4 cops per 1,000 people, okay? Lincoln is not protected. And 3 years ago, it took me 35 minutes to get a cop to my front door on the night that school got out, and there was a bunch of kids out terrorizing the neighborhood, ringing doorbells. And it was the supervisor that came to my house, and he told me...
1 minute.
Okay, he told me there was only 4 cops working the whole south end of Lincoln. That's wrong. That's wrong. These guys are overworked, probably underpaid for what they're doing, okay? And even if you got it to 1.5, this place would be a lot safer. So I was going to say something about the snow removal, but I had a big problem with that. Chelsea Court, we had a tractor go around the circle one time about 10 feet from the edge, piled all the snow up and left. Okay, so we had to go dig out the streets to get out of our driveways. Okay, and then you want all this extra tax money. I think that's wrong too. And the last thing I want to say is I want to say something about Mr. Camp, because I hear he's not coming back. And I've gotten to be sometimes a pest to Mr. Camp, but he's been very patient. He's worked very hard for this city, and I'd just like to say thank you to him for what he's done. So, my time's up.
Timing perfect.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to address the council on this public comment portion? Councilman Camp, I think you're up.
I think no.
Oh, we have one more out.
Come on down.
Mr. Chairman, council members, this was quite the proceeding, a little lengthy, but nevertheless it was good. So what I wanted to address is something very, very brief, and it is something that the gentleman just brought up, and this is an issue of,
Introduce yourself, yeah, please.
My name is Guamar Puok, Guamarpuok.
Thank you.
So, I've been doing a bit of research in terms of the South Sudanese community. So I found that in Australia, there's a very high crime rate. And he mentioned that there's not enough cops for the amount of people given a certain area. Now, if we consider the community that does most of the crime, let's say Australia, Britain, things like that, there's a good majority of it that comes from the South Sudanese community. In Australia, they just dubbed it as Africans. So now if we consider Lincoln and Omaha having the highest number of South Sudanese in the U.S., and we consider the crime rate, I think it's pretty substantial that something has to be done about the kind of crime that is being done, be it aggressive, be it theft of goods. Sometimes it happens to preachers, old people, cars get stolen, things like that. Pregnant women get assaulted. So the kind of crime deserves to be handled and handled immediately. So, maybe it's just a comment or maybe just a concern, but I was wondering what maybe the city has done maybe to handle this. I know this isn't essentially like a Council of Nicaea per se, but there is a lot of wisdom in this room, and I think this type of problem can be handled, brains together, as it were. So, I would also like to possibly lend a hand into handling this thing, because in my younger years, just like most of us, there's a certain level of delinquency that happens, So this is what I wanted to bring forth to the council. Maybe on a personal level, maybe I could get information outside of this room, maybe get my bearings straight from some of you, but that's what I wanted to address.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to talking with you about that. We'll talk a little bit later.
You might introduce yourself to the gentleman at the back of the room with the badge. He's with our police department, and maybe share information, and then he might give you some ideas internally with the police department how you could assist.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, seeing nobody else coming forward, I would move for adjournment and remind people we are not meeting next week for Martin Luther King holiday.
Motion by Camp, second by Christensen. Please call the roll.
Camp?
Yes.
Christensen?
Yes.
Eskridge?
Yes.
Gaylor Baird?
Yes.
Lamb?
Yes.
Raybold?
Yes.
Schob?
Yes.
Motion carried 7-0.
We are adjourned.